If you want to guarantee Jewish rights, what you need is a state that guarantees equal rights for all of its citizens. And I think the proof is in the pudding right now in what's happening with the current government in the state of Israel, which is that a Jewish state does not guarantee Jewish rights. What you have right now is a state that is actually trying to take away Jewish rights.
And we're going. Okay. Zach, again, thank you for coming on. Again, I really, really appreciate it. I'm really looking forward to it. And I want to say about 100 pages deep on a PDF. So I don't know actually how many pages deep I am in a literal sense, but 100 pages deep out of about 250 on the PDF form of your dissertation. I'm really enjoying it. I can't wait to finish it. But also I'm going to get some insight here now on it and into you. So again, thanks for coming on.
It's my pleasure, Troy. Thanks for having me.
I think I lost you. I heard it's my pleasure.
Yeah,
it might have been on my end. I got you now.
Okay, cool. Yeah, my connection should be pretty good, but if you have trouble, just let me know.
I have full bars, but I don't know. I froze for a second. But anyway, again, thanks for coming on.
It's a pleasure to be here, Troy. Thanks for having me.
Of course. And as I mentioned before we hopped on here, I love to start with your story, where you came from, what got you interested in the topic that we're going to talk about. In this case, the invention of Palestine, your dissertation. And so if you just want to take from there, start wherever you want.
Totally. So I grew up in the very exotic suburban Midwest of the United States in the suburb of Detroit. I went to Jewish school growing up, Jewish day school, went to Zionist summer camp growing up, Camp Ramah, went to Israel with my Jewish youth group in high school. And I think that was the starting point for me, was growing up in a very religious, well, not very religious, but let's say a religious household and a Zionist household. And I think that is why when I went to university, I got interested in studying the history of Israel-Palestine. So took university courses. And I think that was the beginning for me in terms of the transition, the shift from Zionism to non-Zionism to anti-Zionism. And I think the first anecdote that I can share with you as to when I really started to get to think more critically about Israeli history, Zionist history, was in Jerusalem. I did a semester abroad at Hebrew University, was enrolled in a intensive Hebrew language course in Ulpan with a lot of Jewish immigrants from Europe, from Latin America, from all around the world, but also Palestinians from East Jerusalem. And for me, I think the first moment I recall thinking like, wait, hold on one sec. Like, what are these Palestinians even doing in this class? Like, they're born and raised in Jerusalem and they don't speak Hebrew? Like, whoa. Okay, that's interesting. Well, why don't they speak Hebrew? Interesting. And so got to know a number of Palestinians in my class, started doing Hebrew language exchanges with them, and eventually got more interested in Arabic and started doing Arabic language exchanges with them. And I think that was really the starting point for me. And that got me interested in reading history and studying the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from a critical historian's perspective, the new Israeli historians. Perhaps you're somewhat familiar with them, people like Benny Morris, Avi Shlaim, Simha Flappin, Ilan Pape. And I think it was reading that critical history that very much stood in contrast to the Zionist history that I was raised with that really got me more interested in Israel-Palestine history, which ultimately led me to do a PhD in Palestinian history and focus my dissertation research, as you well know, on the history of the word Palestine, like the name Palestine. Like, when did people use that word in history in the Middle East, in Europe, in the United States? And then specifically, when did people start to identify as Palestinian? When are the first instances in history where we see an Arabic speaker from Jerusalem, from Jaffa, from Nablus, from Nazareth, using the word Philistini or Philistiniyin in Arabic to refer to themselves and their people? And maybe I'll pause there and you can take the conversation in whichever direction you like.
You got me excited. I'm very excited. I'm very excited to learn. And by the way, I've been learning a lot through your dissertation. I've read a lot about this topic before I jumped in. It actually started in May of 2021 with the IP flare up. This is just so you have background about me. I saw a ton of anti-Semitism and actually including from some squad members that we might talk about at the very end here if we have time. And I got very concerned. I got very, very concerned. And I thought, okay, this is scary. And I'm concerned for my friends and family that live in Israel. And I know Israel isn't innocent. Like, I know like there's something there, but like, I need to know what's happening. I felt this huge obligation and responsibility to figure out what's happening. And just, my childhood and my background, Jewish American, secular Jewish American. And I wasn't raised in a Zionist family. I wasn't raised in a religious family. I was raised in a Midwest town south of Kansas City, Kansas. And It's called Stillwell, Kansas. It's about what you're picturing. It's a one stoplight town. I basically was the diversity there. Like that's what my family was there, but we weren't religious at all. We were just the Jewish family. And, I grew up like I was the Jew, and come Christmas time, like in school and elementary school, hey, here's a dreidel, everybody. Like, this is what this is. And now as I got older, it just different things started happening where I was like, okay, it went from a fun little identity thing to like, oh, I'm different. And I'm different, and this is dangerous. And, and things started. So like that's just where I come from, and there was no history of Zionism versus anti-Zionism. It wasn't really something that was talked about. It wasn't a religious thing for us really, outside of a bar mitzvah or something, which is again more cultural than it was religious in our family. And that's my background. So I really didn't have opinions outside of I want Israel to exist. I want a safe harbor for the Jewish people. And my family, I have family and friends there, and who are both born there for a few generations now and made all in my lifetime. And that's my background. And then in 2021, about midway through the year, again, I started doing a ton of reading and a ton of research, and now I'm having these conversations. I feel like I am educated enough where obviously I still have more learning to do. I'm reading your dissertation, I'm learning more, but I'm educated enough. I can stand my own. I can defend my opinions and question those opinions. Like the goal here, just so you know, as we go forward deeper into the conversation, hopefully a nice, awesome, long conversation, it's truth, it's understanding, it's good faith dialogue, grow perspective, and hopefully whoever this touches, you, me, and whoever listens, it can help guide more conversation and help everyone more move towards a peaceful and liberty-filled existence for all in the region. That is my background. On that note, let's jump into your dissertation, if you don't mind. So however you want to begin. And I love how in the introduction you began with stories. Like stories are very important, where identities come from. If you want to start there and then just go, I'd love to do that.
Yeah, I would say the starting point for my dissertation is that identities like Palestinian, like Israeli, like Jewish, like Muslim, they're invented. They do not exist in nature. I cannot look at your DNA or my DNA and determine whether you're Israeli or whether you're Palestinian. Of course, I can find certain genetic similarities between you and other people who also identify as Palestinian. But that label Palestinian, that label Israeli, that label Jewish, that label Muslim, that label Christian, those are invented, right? All the customs, all the traditions, the words themselves, the histories that we associate with those terms, with those identities, all that we just made up. And the same is, of course, true for all place-based identities. And this is really the starting point for my dissertation, which is called The Invention of Palestine. And so I'm really asking myself, how did this term, this word, this name, Palestine, how did it get invented in history? And by the way, a lot of Palestinians push back on the title of the dissertation because it bothers them that Palestine is an invented place. Of course, all places are invented. Israel's also invented, right? Germany's invented. The United States is invented. There's nothing wrong with invented places. That is just the nature of living in complex societies with complex languages and complex thought. We have to invent places in order to carry on the affairs of a state. You have to invent places. In order to have a conversation with a friend or a family member, you have to use place names, right? So there's nothing wrong with invented places. It's just a fact of living in a complex society with complex thought and complex language. So then the question is, well, how did this place get invented in history? And so what I do is I just trace the history of the word itself in history. When did people first start to use that word? It dates back to ancient Egypt. The first instances of the term Palestine and its antecedents in ancient hieroglyphic sources, Peleshete, Peresheti. We don't know exactly how it's pronounced, but it starts in ancient Egypt. We also find in the Hebrew Bible, of course, Pleshet, Plishtim, the Philistines. We also find in ancient Assyrian sources the same thing. And so from those ancient languages, it then makes its way into Aramaic. From Aramaic, it makes its way into ancient Greek. From Greek, it goes into Latin Rome. And then from Latin, it goes into Arabic. It gets picked up from the Arab conquerors of Palestine adopt the Byzantine usage of the word. So it goes from Byzantium into Arabic, and then from Arabic it goes into all the modern Eastern and modern Western and non-Western and non-Eastern languages that we all know and love today. That's kind of the short of the story. I think what I was trying to do was was trying to unpack some of these assumptions that had been made. I think a lot of scholarship came out in the 1970s. I think Bernard Lewis was first and foremost among the scholars who wrote about the history of the usage of the name Palestine. And I think he was interested in showing that Palestine was not used for the most part from the beginning of the Crusader conquest. So we're talking 11th century up until, let's say, the late 19th, early 20th century, when you have Western imperialism in the Middle East. And from that, let's say that period of about a millennium, that basically the term Arabic fell out of use, was not known in Arabic. No one used the word. That was conventional wisdom that Bernard Lewis propagated and many American politicians embraced, like Ted Cruz, like Mike Huckabee, like Newt Gingrich, and many others. And so that was a traditional, that was a conventional wisdom, was that this term fell out of use. And so what I tried to do in my dissertation was really dig into the Arabic sources from the 11th, the 12th, the 13th, the 14th, the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, and try and just look around. Who was using the word Palestine? In what contexts? Were people even identifying as Palestinian? If so, why? In what context were they identifying as Palestinian? So those are the questions I was asking of primarily Arabic sources. That was my focus, but also Western sources coming out of Europe, coming out of the United States and elsewhere. And really just trying to understand from an empirical point of view, leaving aside all the polemics. When did people use this word and why? And I think just to round out that story, I think the short of it is that from the late, during the early Islamic period, Arabs used the term Palestine. Okay, it was a district in the Muslim Empire, June Philistine, right? For 3 centuries, the term Palestine was used at the administrative level in the Muslim empires, in the Umayyad states. When the Crusaders invaded and conquered the land of the Holy Land, they did not use the term Palestine, and instead they used like the Kingdom of Jerusalem and other names. And then when the Muslims, Salah ad-Din, reconquered the Holy Land, they did not use Palestine either. So at the administrative level, the term Palestine fell out of use from, say, the 11th century until the 20th century. But of course, the term retained its usage in many contexts. Literary scholars, Muslim scholars throughout the ages, in the 12th century or the 15th century or the 17th century or the 18th century, they used the term Palestine for the same reason that you and I have heard of the term Mesopotamia, and for the same reason that we've heard of the term Phoenicia. These are terms that are used to describe lands as they were once known. And that was the same, I think, throughout the entire course of Islamic history. You could probably not go for a decade or even probably a year or two in Islamic history without some or another Muslim writer or even a Christian Arab writer using that term Palestine in a text they wrote, because they were copying and collating texts from earlier eras that used that term. And so they were actually using the term Palestine all the time. You have literally dozens, if not hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of writers, Muslim writers, Christian writers in the Arab world from the 11th century to the 19th century using the term Palestine. So that was one context in which the term retained its usage. The second context in which the term retained its usage was in the city of Ramla. Ramla was the capital of that district of Palestine in the early Islamic period, in the Umayyad period. And so for that reason, it retained its usage in Ramla. And so you have sources, you have a tombstone in the 15th century that actually refers to the Muslim being buried in that tomb. It refers to him as a scholar of the Palestinian frontiers in Ramla. You have a 17th century Ramlan jurist, Khair ad-Din al-Ramla, who used the term throughout his fatwa collection. His son, Najm ad-Din, used the term Ramla in his biographical dictionary of Muslim scholars of his era. You have another scholar, Yusuf Jahshan, an 18th century priest in Ramla, also used the term. You have, as late as the 20th century, you have poets coming from Ramla being referred to as, the poet of Palestine, even though they're from Ramla. And so I think the second context in which you see the term Palestine used, not at a scholarly level to refer to the place as it was once known, but rather in the day-to-day level, the conversational level, the term Palestine retained its usage in the city of Ramla, of all places. And that is not well known and not very well appreciated. That gets us to the 20th century, where, let's say, the late 19th century, where the term gets repopularized. And I'm happy to dive into kind of that repopularization in the 19th century.
Real quick, let's pause there, because you did it. I mean, that's a lot of information. So I just want to pause real quick and just like let myself and listeners just kind of digest. And because you do a great job of, hey, there's the ancient era, pre-modern, modern, postmodern. Like there's all these different eras that we can talk about. And I want to touch really quick on Lewis. You mentioned Lewis, which I think a lot of people won't know. I didn't know before I read your dissertation. He also did a dissertation. What was the year he wrote that again? I can't recall.
I believe Bernard Lewis's dissertation was written on the Ismailiyas, which is a sect of Shia Islam, and I believe he wrote that dissertation before World War II, if I'm not wrong.
Okay, that's what. Okay, no, that's what I thought. I wanted to say it was in the 30s, but I honestly I can't remember. And I thought it was really, really interesting that you wrote about this. I mean, and obviously you're doing research, you should write about this, but you're writing your dissertation and you're covering another dissertation, and we won't know. I am very curious to see. I wonder if there's anything we missed, if there's any new archaeology or any new studies that they find in 2130. And it's just very. I thought that was very interesting. I love that you touched on it. Also, I love that what you write about, when you talk about in the dissertation a lot, and when you're talking about here a lot, is the civilian use instead of just the academic use. Because I had a conversation with Peter Bernard. It's being posted today, actually, right after this episode. I'm going to post that one, and this one will get posted next week. Really excited. But Peter Bernard, one of the things he said to me is, you should focus, when he asked for one of my sources, and I was like, I don't know which source exactly this came from, but I promise you I read it. And he's like, you should focus on the academic sources. And my face kind of gave a stank face. It's like, I agree we should read academic sources. However, a lot of the sources I've read, where academic versus non-academic, the non-academic sources, I'm learning so much that's not mentioned. Also, you don't even have to go back in history. Like, if you just read today, or even in 2000, like recent history, the textbooks that are presented to high schoolers or even young children in Israel versus in Gaza versus in the West Bank, they're full of just different things. It's very, I mean, they're controlled by governments and by the UN, who I have my opinions about, but they're all very different. And I think there's so much value in what you're doing and what you've done and what you're doing, and which is, yeah, hey, let's look at these academic sources, but also look at how people use the word. And this is, as we get into the more modern time, as you go on, you have great examples in your dissertation of, hey, Jewish civilians, however you want to describe them nationalistically, in the 1900s, in the 20th century, they were using, the Bank of Palestine or the Mail of Palestine, whatever it may be. Like, that word was being used, and that's something that's just not really mentioned in the academic readings that I've read. So I love how your dissertation is going. I love where the conversation is going. I just wanted to touch on those parts real quick and take a breath before we move on. But yeah, now that I have done that, do you have anything else you want to add before we move to the next era?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to get into detail on how the word Palestine and the concept of Palestine gets repopularized in the late 19th and early 20th century. As you pointed out, if you go to Palestine in the 1880s or 1890s or 1900s, the term Palestine is starting to appear everywhere, right? If you walk into the old city of Jerusalem in 1901, you're going to see a sign for the Deutsche Bank of Palestine, or is it the Anglo Bank of Palestine? I can't remember which one now. But you have the word Palestine appearing on signs in public spaces. You have individuals starting organizations, like Najib Nassar starts an organization called something like the Agricultural Association of Palestine in 1911 to buy up land to prevent it from falling into the hands of Zionists. You have Palestinian scouting troops. You have Palestine educational bookshops opening in 1910. You have newspapers, Palestine. The first attempt to found a newspaper called Palestine was in 1908. That attempt failed. You have a second person who tries to start a Palestine newspaper in 1909. That also failed. And then in 1911, the Issa cousins found the newspaper that eventually succeeds and survives for many decades. So the word Palestine is being used in Arabic as names of institutions, of stores, of newspapers. Those newspapers are being circulated around Palestine to villages far and wide. It's being read in public cafes in small villages. For the first time in history, you have a Palestinian in a village like Salfit, or in a village like Khan Yunis, standing aloud in a public cafe, reading aloud from a newspaper that's called Palestine. That never happened before 1911. And so I think the name gets institutionalized, it gets popularized, and increasingly people start to call themselves Palestinian in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And we can dive deeper in that vein, but that is really kind of the starting point, I think, late 19th, early 20th century, when you really see the word Palestine get repopularized, both among Jews as well as among Palestinians, as well as among Muslims and Christians. Really, it's all segments of Palestinian society, of Arab Palestinian society. Yeah, beginning in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Yeah, let's jump into, actually, real quick before we do jump into that, because there's a period. I don't want to spend too much time on the period. Unless you want to. I just don't know much about it. However, you do mention Lewis talks about geographers and scientists and philosophers. And the philosophers really stood out to me. And then you go on to say, but he doesn't like quote anybody. He doesn't have any, which I was like, oh, dang, I wanted to learn. But the philosopher stood out to me because in my readings, in my research, in my offline conversations, the philosophers, when it comes to the topic of Jews, is something that like this conversation will primarily obviously focus on Palestine and the invention and obviously your distinction. However, when it comes to the topic of Jews, it's something that shouldn't be ignored. And it's something that John Paul Sartre, is how you say his name? He wrote about Jews. He wrote a book called Antisemitism. Nietzsche, he writes a lot about Jews. And then Immanuel Kant, he actually, you mentioned him very briefly. I was curious to see, once I saw that, I kind of like hit, Control F or whatever. And it's like, I wonder how much he gets mentioned, but he only gets to mention that one time. But I do want to mention Immanuel Kant real quick. That name actually, so he was a philosopher in the 1700s. I want to say it was the 18th century. I'm pretty sure. And he talks about Palestinians. And the thing is that when he says Palestinian, he really means Jew. He didn't like Jews. He wasn't a fan of us. And it's interesting how throughout the centuries, it goes back and forth a little bit between who that word refers to. And like you said, as I've learned from you and others, it's around the 1880 to the 1920 where that term is repopularized. And correct me if I'm wrong, but that's when this term is repopularized in the way that we know it now, in the Palestinian identity that we know it now. That's correct? Yeah.
Yeah, let's get into that. So the word Palestinian, let's start with English sources, and then we can talk about Hebrew sources and Arabic sources, because the word gets used to refer to different things in different languages. So it's important that we're aware of what language we're talking about. So starting with the English sources, if you look at 19th century English sources, and let's bundle in like German sources as well, which tend to, I think, use the word in similar ways. The first instance I'm able to find of an English language source or any other, let's say Western European language source, using that term to refer to the native Arabic-speaking inhabitants of Palestine is by James Finn. He is I believe, a British consul in Jerusalem in the 1870s, and he's using that term. I think in 1870 he publishes a work, and he's using the term Palestinian in that book to refer to the Arabic-speaking inhabitants of Palestine. That is, as far as I can tell, the first instance that term is being used in the English language to refer to the modern Arabic-speaking inhabitants of Palestine. Now, before that, you can find the term Palestinian in the 1830s, in the 1850s, in the 1860s in English sources, but in most cases, it's usually used to refer to basically Palestine during biblical times. So there'll be references to the Palestinians like Jesus, or Palestinians of the ancient world, and they're described as Palestinian. Or they'll be the Palestinian fauna of the 1st or 2nd century BCE, right? So the term is really primarily used to describe the ancient peoples. Also, remember, in the 19th century, Europeans and Americans were obsessed with the ancient world. They didn't care all that much about the modern inhabitants. The modern inhabitants were interesting only to the extent that they told us something about the ancient world, about Jesus and about Moses and about Abraham, because these were Bible-believing Christians. These were theologians. These people believed the Bible was the word of God. And in order to understand the word of God, in order to get closer to God, in order to understand Jesus and get closer to Jesus, all you had to do was go to modern Palestine, and you'd see Jesus's great-great-great-great-great-grandparents, grandchildren, or rather Jesus's contemporaries' great-great-great-great-great-grandkids. So the term is primarily used in context to refer to ancient people that lived contemporary to the time of Jesus. And then in the late 19th century, it started to get used increasingly to refer to the modern inhabitants. And so you find an American, you find that British source, you find American sources. There's an American traveler who uses the term Palestinian already in the 1880s. You find the term in a German source. Ludwig, I believe is his name. He's a German Protestant missionary in Palestine, uses the term in his, I think it's a travel log in the 1880s, or maybe it's the 1890s. And so this term starts to get used in Western sources to refer to the native Arabic-speaking inhabitants of Palestine. The first instance that I find the term in Arabic, now let's shift over to Arabic sources. The first instance we find the term Palestinian in Arabic sources to refer to a modern Arabic-speaking inhabitant of Palestine is in a book published by Khalil Beiras. It's a travel guide to the Holy Land that was translated from a Russian book from a Russian archaeologist's account of the Holy Land. It's a travelogue. It's talking about the Palestine seasons and the weather of Palestine and the crops of Palestine and the people of Palestine, referring to them as Palestinians in Arabic in 1898. And then from that point onwards, from the early 20th century onwards, the term gets increasingly used in Arabic. So you have multiple instances in 1901 in Arabic referring to Palestinian or Palestinians. And then it just picks up from there. And really by the second decade of the 20th century, the term appears hundreds of times in Arabic, Philistini or Philistiniyin, to refer to Arabic-speaking inhabitants of Palestine. Now, to get to this question of like, were Jews also known as Palestinian? It's a great question. The answer is yes, they were. So what happens is when the British occupy Palestine in 1917 and establish a mandate for Palestine in 1922 that gets ratified by the League of Nations, they introduced something called a Palestinian citizenship in 1925. And they define that Palestinian citizenship as applying to any Jew or any Arab or anyone living in British Mandatory Palestine is now called a Palestinian. Be them Zionist Jews, be them Palestinian Arabs, they're all Palestinians now. And in fact, they're actually very explicit to say this refers to both non-Jews and Jews because they know that the term had already come into use in Arabic to refer to primarily Muslim and Christian Arabs. Question mark Jews. We can get into that if you're curious. But and so the term comes into English now in the 1920s to refer to any subject of the British Mandatory government. And so you see in all kinds of English language sources, also Yiddish sources, also German sources, you see the term, Palestinian Jewry, or Jewish Palestinian Jews to refer to Jewish Zionists living in Palestine in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s.
So let's actually before we get into the 30s and 40s, because I by the way, how much time do you have today?
We can go as long as you want.
Amazing. Okay. So that's awesome. So I can feel good about Palestine. So I would love to get into that because I know today part of the information of the word Palestine, and not just Palestine, Zionist. I mean, there's a lot of words: genocide, apartheid, occupation. A lot of words. Like we're thinking different things. And there was a ridiculous tweet, for example, of Corey something, a Jewish guy who he flew into Belgium and he saw a Palestinian flag painted on a wall. And he basically accused the Belgium government of being anti-Semitic. And I was like, no, man, no, don't. No, that's not no. And I understand being scared if you see that. Like but it's just not anti-Semitic. And so it's a very much inflamed word. And I am curious to learn about in the Arabic version of the word before 1930, 40, 56, before you go over there, when you mentioned like it referred to Jews, ? What were Jews considered Palestinian from an Arabic point of view, or can we dive down that real quick before moving to more modern times?
Yeah, it's a really fantastic question, and I'd love to get into that because I think there are a lot of misconceptions about the native Jews of Palestine and what they how they refer to themselves. Who were they, and so on. So on the eve of Zionist immigration, so we're talking 1880s, there were something like Palestine was something like 85% Muslim, 10% Christian, 5% Jewish. So there were Jews. They were a very small minority of the total population of Palestine at the time. Now, of that 5% of Palestine that was Jewish, something like, let's talk about what languages they spoke. 40% of them spoke Ladino as a native language. Ladino is like Judeo-Spanish language. Mm-hmm. It's basically Spanish. 40% of them spoke Yiddish. Okay, these were Ashkenazi Jews that spoke Yiddish that had immigrated to Palestine in the prior century.
Real quick question: the Ladino language, did that come from Sephardic Jews that came back from Morocco, Spanish areas?
Yes, that is my understanding. Yes, that is correct.
That makes sense. Okay.
So 40% spoke Ladino as a native language. 40% spoke Yiddish as a native language, and something like 7% spoke Arabic as a native language. But let's also point out that of those 40% Ladino speakers, a majority also spoke Arabic as a second language. Okay, so and these Jews of Palestine on the eve of Zionist immigration, they lived primarily in Jerusalem, Tiberias, Safed, and Hebron, and a small community in Jaffa. Okay, and so the question is like, did they identify as, when the term Palestinian came into use in Arabic, beginning in, like I said, 1898, and then gaining traction in the early 20th century, did those Arab Jews, did they did they see themselves as part of that emerging Palestinian Arab identity? And the answer is it's not really well known. It's not clear. If you ask me, I've never come across a Jew referring to him or herself in the late Ottoman period as Palestinian. Louis Fishman, who is a historian based, I think, out of CUNY, he would tell you that no, the Jews in Palestine did not refer to themselves. They would not have included themselves in that emerging Arab Palestinian identity. But it's unclear. Like, we just don't have that many Jews writing in Arabic in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. We're literally talking about a very small number of Jews. The newspapers of the Jewish community were either in Ladino. You have a Ladino newspaper coming out of Jerusalem. In the, I believe it starts to get published in the early 20th century. You also have Hebrew. The Hebrew language is being used by this Jewish community of Palestine. So you have Hebrew, you have Ladino, and you have Yiddish spoken. And in those three languages, as far as I can tell, they were not using the term Palestinian. They would have referred to themselves, either as the Jews of Palestine, or the Jews of Jerusalem, or the Jews of Safad, or Ashkenazim, or Sfaradim. But I'm not familiar with any sources that refer to the native Jews of Palestine as Palestinian. However, that is not to say that they weren't very much integrated into the Arabic, communities that they were a part of. So you have anecdotes from A.B. Yehoshua's father, for example, the very famous Israeli essayist. You have his father publish a memoir. I believe A.B. Yeshua published a memoir in which he talks about his father telling him these stories. And he talks about how, growing up in Jerusalem in the 1910s, you had Arabs and Jews, Muslim Arabs and Jews playing in courtyards together, living in the same housing complexes where the Jews and the Muslim kids all play together. You have anecdotes where Jews would celebrate Muslim holidays and Muslims would celebrate Jewish holidays. I mean, imagine in 1908, in 1902, in 1885, you had Muslims going together to celebrate Jewish holidays in Sheikh Jarrah with the native Jews of Palestine celebrating together. Okay, they're very different from the interactions between Muslims and Jews today in Sheikh Jarrah. But basically, these communities were very much intertwined. They all saw themselves as Ottomans. They all saw themselves as like loyal Ottoman subjects. So you had a lot of connections between the Jews and the Muslims and the Christians in terms of like I said, living in the same communities, shopping in the same stores, living in the same housing complexes, celebrating each other's religions. But in terms of that specific word Palestinian, no, I have not found a source, and I'm not aware of any sources. But that's not to say we won't find one in the future.
Again, one of those things that the Lewis dissertation from the 30s to your dissertation to maybe a dissertation in 2130, there's things that there's things we don't know, and there's things that may come to find out. And I do wonder if kind of let's say with the knowledge we have, Jews did not identify as Palestinian. I do wonder if that had anything or how much of that had to do with they were second-class citizens in the Ottoman Empire, and not even that the neighbors saw themselves that way. Because I've read stories. Actually, my favorite book, it is right here about this, is called Arab and Jew. It's the Pulitzer Prize winner. I really enjoy it. It's really just like a collection of hundreds and hundreds of stories from Jews and Arabs in the area and about their parents and their grandparents and what was going on. It was published in the 80s, I want to say, so a tiny bit dated, but it's just really, really good. And there's tons of stories of Jews and Arab children playing together. They exist peacefully. They exist peacefully up until these. Really, I'd say it starts in the late 20s from my education, and then obviously it ramps up when in the 40s, in the late 40s, obviously. And I wonder if the kind of refusal to identify as Palestinian comes from the fact that there were taxes that they had to pay, being Jews, that others, Christians and Arabs, Europeans and Arabs, didn't have to pay. There were certain asset classes they weren't allowed to, and I wonder if that plays the part. It's very curious to see, because that, what we know, I'll call it a fact for now at least, that fact that, hey, they didn't identify this way, that if Jews did identify as Palestinian in 1900, 1910, I do wonder how history changes today. It's one of those very small things, the butterfly effect, and it's cool to learn. It's very cool to learn. So knowing that, now let's move. And also, I just want to mention Hebron at the end of this conversation, towards the end of this conversation. I think Hebron is one of the key cities to keep in mind when talking about the conflict in current context. It's something that like I could talk so long about it. It's not talked about enough that Hebron was a Jewish city for thousands of years. Thousands of years. I mean, continuously since the finding of the Israelites all the way through 1929, the Hebron massacre, and now it's this disputed land. And I think that land within the land itself, that land in particular, is just like such a. It should be talked about more, in my opinion. So I just really wanted to it was mentioned before. You mentioned it before, so I just wanted to throw that out there for maybe an hour from now. We can come back to this, but 1920s, 1930s, 40s. Let's move forward.
Yeah. So from the 1920s onwards, Palestine, the term Palestine is no longer it's no longer a term that is used in the names of banks and associations and scouting troops and bookstores. Now it is the name of a state, the state of Palestine. It's printed on the word Palestine. It's printed on passports, stamps, coins. It is printed, it is circulating in now not just one newspaper, but multiple newspapers. It is the name that is being used in internationally to refer to the land. So it really gets institutionalized and widely embraced and adopted by everyone, Jews and Arabs alike.
Mhm.
So it's not controversial, right? That Jews are not like, oh, we need to call it Israel. No, that hasn't happened yet. Jews
Yeah.
all call it Palestine. They all say we're the Jews of Palestine. They even call themselves Palestinian Jews. Although I would say they don't really call themselves Palestinians in English or Yiddish or German, right?
Mhm.
The term the Palestinians is not really used to refer to the Jews, right? They use that as an adjective to qualify what type of Jew they are. They're a Palestinian Jew, but they don't use it as the plural, like the
Yeah.
Palestinians. So that's worth pointing out.
I
But
want to quickly point out everything you said is absolutely correct, factual. It wasn't a sovereign state. It was under the British mandate. I think it's worth pointing out that up until the current moment, there has not been a sovereign state of Palestine. But please continue.
yeah, fair point. The British mandate for Palestine is it's recognized by the League of Nations to the extent that matters. It is it's part of the British Empire, right? It's not an independent state in any sense, right? It's ruled by a British military governor who is appointed from London. The locals have no say in who gets appointed, right? This is not in any sense some kind of independent, democratic state at all. It's just it's a military occupation, if you want to call it that, or a colonial state, but it's not independent in any real sense. So like I said, the term Palestine is now one among many, let's say, colonial states in the world. And so the term is widely embraced by everybody, non-controversially. And so, at the same time, I would say the term Arab Palestinian, it gets embraced not just amongst a small segment of the population, among that small percentage of Palestinians that are literate in the early 20th century. But now, as education expands, as more schools open up, there's an Arab college that opens up. The British do expand education within the mandate. And so you have a ton of schools now. They're all learning with books called The History of Palestine, The Geography of Palestine. We're talking, many tens and thousands of youth going to school, Arab youth going to school in Palestine, learning about Palestinian geography and Palestinian history with Palestine maps. And now the term Palestinian is widespread across British mandatory Palestine, from Nazareth to Beersheba to Jaffa. Everyone is calling the place Palestine, and the Arabs are calling themselves Palestinians. I mean, by 1948, you have many thousands and thousands and thousands of instances of the term Palestinian, Philistini being used in Arabic texts, in Arabic journals, in Arabic newspapers, on Arabic signs to describe Arabic associations, to describe the Palestine Law Association and the Palestine Agricultural Association and the Palestine Scouting Troop, as we said. So the term is now embraced basically by everybody, Jews and Arabs alike. And I think that gets us to 1948. Maybe I'll pause there and we can pick up wherever you like.
Yeah, so that great place to pause. Obviously 48 is a massive turning point in the story of Palestine and Israel and Jews and Arabs and all of that. I mean, again, definitely 1920s, late 1920s, I think there's really a turning point of a tide is shifting of peaceful coexistence to these two people existing on top of each other's dreams. And that's kind of where that tide starts to turn. And that's where it's just this 48 point is going to be a big point. And I do want to point out to anyone that might be skeptical, because there's buckets that we get put into for better or worse. And I said this with Peter as well. Like, if I had to put us into buckets, and there was only two of them, pro-Israel, pro-Palestine, I'm falling the pro-Israel bucket. I actually wouldn't put you in any bucket from this conversation. However, following you on Twitter, I would put you in the pro-Palestine bucket if I had to. And I don't like doing that. I know it's simplistic and way over simplistic, but people, especially if someone hates watching this, hate listening to this because like they know you and they don't like you from Twitter, they're gonna just, that's how their interpretation of everything you say is gonna come out. However, so I do want to point out, like, almost in your defense, everything you said is factual and true, is that go read The Jewish State by Theodore Herzl, who is credited. I think there's many people who, secular and non-secular. That was one of the things with Peter, who said it's a very religious thing, which obviously there was religiously pushed for sure. But however, I've read the stories of Mizrahim and Sephardic Jews and Jews who were secular, who also wanted a homeland back in the indigenous homeland of the Jewish people. Theodor Herzl was the guy. He was the one that made it famous and all of this stuff. And he refers to it as Palestine. It wasn't a controversial thing. I know a lot of Jews that don't think a Palestinian existed until the 60s, when Yasser Arafat really made it famous, I'd say worldwide. Like, the flag came into being, all these things happened. We'll get there. But there are a lot of Jews that just don't think at all and kind of refuse to accept, like, hey, the Palestinian verbiage, the Palestinian identity did exist before this 48 moment in time. And that moment in time, everything, it's a huge moment. So I wanted to point that out, just because some people may be dismissing what you say just because they see you on Twitter, and there's these preconceptions. So listen to Theodore Herzl. If anyone that disagrees with Zach here, listen to that guy.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I don't think the history of the usage of the word Palestine is political. I don't understand why someone would draw a conclusion about who has the right to evict people, Palestinians living in Sheikh Jarrah in 2022. What that has anything to do with whether or not an Arab in Jaffa called the place Palestine or Syria in 1902. Those are unrelated things to me. I don't understand why it is that, whether or not people are calling the place Palestine in the 18th century, the 15th century, what that has anything to do with Palestinians being expelled, from Masal Fariyata in 2023, right? They're unrelated, right? It has nothing to do with it. So people who insist on trying to politicize this history, I think they just don't understand that these things are not related. And I would challenge anyone who wants to, claim that they are related. I would challenge you to really explain to me why, because I don't see the connection.
Well, it's hard for me to do this because I agree with you, but let me try and steel man it. So I think it's the fact that everything is politicized. And so, like, the word Zionist is politicized, and the word Palestinian is, the word occupation, the word apartheid, these things, all of these words, when it comes to Israel, Palestine, they have no one, genocide too, like, all of these words, no one's talking about what they actually mean. Like, go to Google and look up the definition, and this is what this says. Is this that? Yes or no? Nobody cares. Literally, I get infuriated by it. And even when I was like, this is one of my big pet peeves with humanity. It's like when I was 14, 15, having arguments about anything, sports or anything at all, with friends, like, I would go to Google, like, this is the definition. They go, it's not what I'm saying. I'm like, dude, but you can't say that word then. You can't say that word. But the problem is, we do. Propaganda is a thing. And actually, you mentioned it in your dissertation. I want to say, was it Trump and Cruz? Were they having the debates when Trump said something anti-Palestine? And Cruz just kind of sits with a smile because, like, he said the word Palestine, and Cruz knew, like, that's bad for him. You shouldn't even say that word. So, like, unfortunately, it just is. And the word, when you say Palestinian, certain people are going to think certain things. Certain people are going to think conquerors. Certain people are going to think indigenous. Certain people are going to think, like, that. That's why it is political. And I agree with you. It shouldn't be. Like, it shouldn't matter at this point in time in 2023. It just shouldn't matter what word someone's using to identify themselves. The sad fact of politics and propaganda is that that's just what we do as humans.
Yeah, the anecdote that you brought up there, the Ted Cruz, Donald Trump 2016 primary, I believe it was at an AIPAC policy conference.
Yes.
It was, I think, Donald Trump, mentioned the word Palestine. I don't remember exactly in what context.
It was anti-Palestine. Obviously, he's at an AIPAC conference, so he's got to say the anti-Palestine.
He was
thing.
obviously, he obviously was just totally ignorant. He had no idea that even saying the word Palestine would be problematic to all these
Yeah.
AIPAC supporters. But in any case, he says the word Palestine. And again, probably in a context basically saying like, something against Palestine.
Yes.
But basically Ted Cruz comes on right after him and says, contrary to the comments made by the previous speaker, Palestine has not existed since 1948. And then the whole crowd, gets up, starts cheering. And it's kind of crazy. I mean, to think that everyone is cheering at the thought that an entire group's people's identities, was kind of erased and wiped off the map. I mean, the idea, and I think that's basically the problem here, which is that, and it's the reason why it gets politicized, right? Is because for Israel, for people who believe in Jewish sovereignty, for people who believe in a Jewish state, they believe that Jews have inherent self-determination rights in the land of Israel. Why is that? So we can talk about why, but basically they believe that Jews have rights to sovereignty in the land of Israel.
By the way, I believe that. But keep
great,
going.
We can get into that. I mean, that's a great conversation to have.
Yeah.
But if you believe that Jews have self-determination rights in the land of Israel, then wouldn't it be great if there never was a place called Palestine and there never were a people called the Palestinians?
It'd be very fortunate to believe that.
Then they may as well just, either move to Syria or move to Jordan or just live as second-class citizens, without any national rights in the state of Israel. So I think that's ultimately the goal. It's to prove that these people didn't exist. They never called the place Palestine. They don't have any distinct identity, and thus they're not entitled to political rights. They're not entitled to a state. We don't have to, withdraw from the occupied territories. We don't have to give them a citizenship. We don't need to respect their political rights. So I think ultimately that is the reason why it gets politicized, is because of Jewish nationalism and the concept of Jewish self-determination in the land of Israel.
Yeah, I agree. I'd also argue that's the reason, from my understanding of Zionism, when I learned what Zionism was, like I identify as a Zionist. However, the definition I use, I don't think most people even think anymore, because like, Zionism, I think, has been politicized, and maybe the definition I see, or the definition on Google, isn't the one that people think or say or should be used. Because when I hear that, I think an extremist, like an extreme Zionist, and an basically an alt-right. Like, that's what I think, versus, to me, what Zionism is like, yeah, like, hey, Jews for thousands of years have not been able to live anywhere as first-class citizens, and never for a long time safely anywhere on this earth. We need to do this. So I think our people, my friends and family, like, we should be able to exist safely somewhere with self-determination. And it makes sense to me that that is in the indigenous land, although I was born after this. So if it ended up being in Madagascar instead, which is one of the places that was discussed, I think that'd be more wrong. And I don't think you could have gotten the backing and all of those things. That's what I that's what I think when I hear Zionist. And in my mind, the word Zionist has been so politicized to mean this is somebody that denies the existence of the Palestinian identity. This is somebody that wants all of the land, that wants no Palestinian state. That's what a Zionist is. Zionists are bad. So like, and to me, it is a dog whistle. It really is a dog whistle of, I don't hate Jews, I hate Zionists. And it's like, well, before this term got politicized, and this happened in the last 5 years. Before this term got politicized, well over 90%, I want to say it was well over 95% of Jews identified as Zionist. And all of a sudden, people do what people do. The anti-Israel people, and there's anti-Palestine, anti-Israel, it's anti-Semitic, there's Islamophobic. There's anti-Palestinian. They all exist. The anti-Israel, anti-Semitic people were very successful in changing how the word Zionist was viewed, as in, hey, the Jewish people just want to live somewhere safely with a Jewish safe harbor state, versus they want to destroy the Palestinian identity, which the vast majority of Jews don't want to do. And I mean, the current Israeli government, we can and we'll talk about later on. That's I think that's a very, very strong argument that is what they want to do in the current Israeli regime. But in my mind, like, the word Palestine has been politicized against Palestinians the same way the word Zionist has been politicized against Jews. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I think if I could respond to some things you just said, I would say that, in my view, if you want to guarantee Jewish rights, what you need is a state that guarantees equal rights for all of its citizens. And I think the proof is in the pudding right now, in what's happening with the current government in the state of Israel, which is that a Jewish state does not guarantee Jewish rights. What you have right now is a state that is actually trying to take away Jewish rights. Right? They're trying to take away the balance of power right now. They're trying to remove any checks and balances on the current government to do all kinds of things. Right? Not just against. Right, and not just against Palestinians, but against Jews, and that's why the protesters on the streets over the past 18 weeks, they're not Palestinian, they're Jews. The Jews protesting Jewish self-determination and Jewish domination of other Jews. So I think the way you guarantee Jewish rights is with equal rights for all. And I think, by the way, this is also evident long before the current government came to power. Jews are very unsafe in Israel relative to many, if not most, other places where Jews live in the world. Okay, a Jew is targeted in the state of Israel for being Jewish by a Palestinian who's angry about being displaced and being ethnically cleansed and having their homes demolished and being confined into Bantustans and being besieged in Gaza. Jews are now targets. Jews have made themselves targets. Where else in the world are you targeted by terrorists every single day? There's people trying to blow up Jews in Israel all the time. Bad people.
Yes.
Terrorists that are trying to blow up Jews. Where else in the world do you have on a daily basis people trying to blow up Jews? Where? I mean, can you think of another country?
So I think that's I do love this conversation. Okay, I'm really excited to have this conversation. This might last for 30 minutes. Eventually, I do want to get to back to your dissertation, back to 48. That was our stopping point, but let's continue with this because I love it. I freaking live for these conversations. So, yes, but no. So they're at war. Whatever you want to call it, I agree it's an occupation. I agree that Palestinian people are being oppressed. It's still a war. Like whatever's happening right now, it can be defined as war, and you can say there's a huge imbalance of power. And we can go down a huge rabbit hole of what this is, but the Palestinian terrorists, some might call freedom fighters, some may call soldiers, and they are attacking Jewish civilians, which I think is wrong, but it's their version of fighting back, and I condemn it. I condemn Hamas, Hezbollah, the Lion's Den, all those. I very much condemn. However, it's easier for me to sit there and be able to find a rational, emotionless defense of that than it is for me terrorism against Jews all around the world. Let's take, for example, in May 2021. That was like my big moment of I need to learn about this, right? Here's what was happening. In 2020 and 2021 in America, George Floyd happens. There's a huge Black Lives Matter movement. I support that. Stop Asian Hate. That's a huge movement. There's protest. I support that. There's equal rights movement for women. There's protests for over abortion laws. I support that. There is LGBTQ protests and rights. I support that. The world is supporting this. I shouldn't say the world. Americans are supporting this. That is happening. All of a sudden, this era of social justice dies, and it dies the moment Jews need it. Because here's what's happening in May 2021. The IP conflict flares up. There's thousands of rockets being shot from Gaza by Hamas into Israel, and we can get into the details of what pre-led to that and all of that. Around the world, Jews are being attacked everywhere. I mean, they're getting stabbed in Boston, they're getting jumped in Brooklyn and in LA, in Chicago, everywhere. It's happening everywhere. That's very different than what's happening in Israel. And by the way, it's happening in Europe too. And it would be happening in the Middle East too if there were Jews. Like an old woman in May 2021, old Jewish woman in France, got murdered. And her killer was found innocent because he was high on marijuana. By the way, I've smoked marijuana in Europe. You can smoke 50 of those joints. You won't get high. Like you won't. And you can smoke one joint in Colorado and you'll get way higher. And also, it's not a drug that makes you do that. It's just... There's real racism, there's real problems, and all of a sudden this moment of social justice dies. Nobody says anything other than Jews. The blue square goes up from Jews. I don't know if you saw that. Remember that moment? But it was basically it was trying to take the black square moment from George Floyd's murder and adapting it to Jews, and only Jews. No one else posted anything. It was a very humbling moment of, okay, yeah, no, we stand alone here. All right, this and that's where the I know I'm kind of going on a different route here for a second, but like that's where the connection, the indigenous connection, yes, but also like Palestinians and Arabs weren't being attacked in Europe. There weren't anyone driving through the streets of Britain, for example, saying kill the Arabs, rape their daughters. There were people driving through the streets chanting, kill the Jews, rape their daughters. And there are Jews getting attacked all over Europe, all over America, wherever there are Jews. And like that's terrorism. That's straight up terrorism versus in Israel. It's a war. And like, yeah, it's terrorism, and it breaks my heart when I see Jews or Palestinians. I mean, obviously I'm Jewish, but like Jews or Palestinians getting killed, innocents getting killed. It's horrible, but that's a war. It's very different. If you're going to say, if we're going to use that word terrorism, that's terrorism. Like there's no reason. And by the way, when I was in high school, I'm sure we'll get into this later at some point, but like when I was in high school, my Jewish community center just north of my small town in Overland Park, Kansas, got shot up by a Nazi. That's terrorism. Like they're undeniable. You can't define it any other way. Versus in Israel, and I agree that part of the reason this is happening is because of the government, is because of the Israeli government. Like you can argue they're soldiers, you can argue they're freedom fighters, even though they're going for civilians. Unfortunately, does that whole rant make sense at all?
Yeah, let me respond to that. So
yeah, please.
I think at the most basic level, when we talk about anti-Semitism, we're talking about attacks against Jews because they're Jews.
Yeah.
And that's happening in the United States, it's happening in Europe, and it's happening in Israel.
Yeah.
And I think the point I was making earlier was that the most intense forms of that anti-Semitism, of people being targeted for being Jewish, is taking place in Israel, much more so than the United States or Europe. And I don't really think that's deniable. I mean, I think the numbers are pretty clear on this. Like how many Jews died of attacks in Israel over the past year and a half? It's probably maybe
Hundreds.
North of 20. Yeah, I mean, we could pull up the numbers, but it's like many, let's say a couple of dozen.
But
in the
again,
United States,
like
and relative to a population, of say like, however many, 7-8 million Jews in Israel. So whereas in Europe, how many Jews have died of anti-Semitic attacks in Europe over the past year or two? It's less than that. The United States is probably less than that as well. Now, so I think just like on the strictly speaking by the numbers, like you're much more likely to die for being Jewish as a Jew in Israel than you are in Europe or the United States by the numbers. Now, let's talk about the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe and the U.S. because it's a big problem, as you pointed out. The first point to make here is that it's not just a rise in anti-Semitism, right? It's a rise in anti-trans hate. It's a rise in anti-Black racism. It's a rise in anti-immigrant racism in Europe.
100%.
And in fact, you made this point, I think, that we're not seeing anti-Arab racism in Europe, but in fact, we're seeing a huge amount of anti-immigrant racism in Europe. I mean, it's a big problem. I mean, you just talk to any Turk living in Germany, talk to any Algerian living in France, talk to any Afghan living in Britain, talk to any minority immigrant population in Europe. They face a tremendous amount of racism and a tremendous amount of discrimination, and very similar to the anti-Semitism that Jews face, right? So
I want to clarify very quickly. When I said there is an anti-Arab hate, there's an Islamophobia. There is Islamophobia. I didn't mean that. I meant how do I explain this? So in the sense of, I understand this actually isn't really connected to what we were talking about, but I feel like I should clarify that. That does exist. That 100% does exist. I can't remember the last time a mosque was attacked in America, but I want to say it was like 2019, 2020. It wasn't that long ago. And in Europe, obviously, it's more so because they're right there, the proximity, and the proximity of Israel being, where it is, and the proximity of Arabs and Europeans being where they are versus in America, that has a lot to do with it, for sure. Absolutely.
Let me finish my point if you don't mind me jumping back in here, because I had a few other points to make. So first point was that Jews are more likely to be targeted and killed for being Jewish in Israel than they are anywhere else in the world. That's the first point. The second point is that there's there's racism, and that comes in the form of anti-Semitism. It comes in the form of anti-immigration, anti-immigrants, anti-Black racism, anti-transphobia, all kinds of racism taking place in the United States and Europe, and it's on the rise. And I think the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe and the United States should be understood within that context. And I think it's worth trying to unpack what is going on in the US and Europe and elsewhere around the world, by the way. It's not just those two places, but what is going on that is leading to the rise in racism and hatred and bigotry. I think first and foremost, if I had to identify just a single cause, I think it's social media, because social media is polarizing in many respects. And so it's of course not just driving more racism, it's driving more polarization just on the political spectrum, where you've never had Republicans and Democrats, more divided than they are today. You've never had more, you've never had such a polarized country. And I think what social media does is it's an attention economy. And we all know that the way you drive attention is by enraging people. Enragement equals attention, and the way you enrage people is by emotionally triggering content. And that polarizes people. When I tweet out about Israeli apartheid, it does much better than when I tweet out kind of nuanced analysis of what's going on the Israeli protest movement. People are triggered by emotional content that gets at your emotions, and that's what's going to get you to share and like and comment and stay on the platform and be engaged. And unfortunately, this is the world we live in, where our attention is being monetized. We are the product. And so in order for these companies to engage us, I'm as guilty as anyone else in this, in order for them to engage us, they have to enrage us. And so that's the world we live in. And so, we've never been in a more polarized context than we are living in today. And so I think that has all kinds of effects on, I think that in large part explains the rise of all of this hatred and bigotry that we see today, both in Europe and in the United States. That's the third point I would make. The fourth point I would make is that you see spikes in anti-Semitism whenever Israel goes on killing sprees. So in the 2008 war in Gaza, Israel killed a few hundred Palestinians. You see this big spike in anti-Semitic incidents in the US and Europe. In the 2014 war in Gaza, you see a big spike in anti-Semitic incidents. When Israel killed 2,000 Palestinians, all of a sudden, there's all this anti-Semitism that blows up. And then in 2021, the same thing happened. A spike in anti-Semitic incidents after Israel killed hundreds of Palestinians in Gaza and dozens in the West Bank and also in Israel. So, and I think that, the connection there is pretty obvious, right? Israel claims it's a Jewish state. It claims to represent Jews around the world. It doesn't just claim to, it does. In fact, Jews anywhere in the world can move to Israel and get a passport and get citizenship and get a free place to live. And so a state that comes out and says, we're a state of the Jews, no matter where Jews are, doesn't surprise me that then there's retaliation against Jews when that state goes and kills people, hundreds of Palestinians in Gaza and commits war crimes and so on and so forth. So
I respond to that real quick?
Please do,
because I think you have it. I think you have the connection backwards. And I think this is extremely important, actually. I think this is one of the most important things that we could talk about as far as the Jewish perspective goes. And eventually, I knew this was going to take like 30, 40 minutes here, but eventually I do want to get back to your dissertation. But I think this is one of the most important things, because you're correct. What you just pointed out is super correct, that anti-Semitism spikes when Israel kills Palestinians. Whenever the conflict spikes and there's the miniature war inside the war, however you want to call it. And obviously it's going to end up in deaths of civilians, unfortunately. And obviously with the power imbalance, it's going to end up in the death of more Palestinians than Israelis. However, you just have it backwards. You just do. It's not that, no one's thinking, Israel represents the Jews. They say they represent the Jews, so we need to go kill the Jews. It's they just see Israel as the big Jew, and whether Israel, no matter what policies Israel has, Israel is going to be the big Jew. Even if today they said we are no longer a Jewish state, you can't, if you're Jewish, you can't come here. You get rid of all that. It's still the biggest Jewish population on earth, and anytime Israel gets involved in any sort of attack or anything, the anti-Semitism is going to spike. And it doesn't matter what Israel's policies are; they're the big Jew, and the evidence of this is how people treated Jews forever. Like the connection to the land it's not the connection to just to the state. The connection to the land isn't just indigenous. It's the fact that we are Israel, whether we like it or not. And we are, as this big Jew exists now. There's the biggest Jewish population in a tiny, tiny, tiny country. And we're connected to that because we're Jews, and we're just there is this connection now. So even though we don't get to vote and we don't have any say what Israel does, and there's nothing like that, Jews are going to be attacked. Like you said, you're right. Like Jews are going to be attacked when this happens, and whenever Israel can get blamed for anything, Jews will be attacked. And it's because it doesn't matter what Israel's policies are. It just does. Like, if it mattered what Israel's policies were, then why would there be so much anti-Semitism for thousands of years now? And that's also, real quick before you respond, that's like when I talk about connection to the land and connection to the state and all these things, I'm not erasing Palestinian connection to that land at all. At least that's not my intent at all. You can be connected to that land, be Palestinian, but if a Palestinian goes and kills 100 Jews in a terrorist attack, there's not gonna be rows of people in Europe and America in all these cities all around attacking Palestinians. It's gonna happen with Jews, whether we like it or not. We are connected to that land and we are connected to that state, and I don't think it honestly doesn't matter what Israel's policies are. It really it doesn't, because if it did, I don't understand how. Like, how is that even possible? That it's just the policies. Oh, it's just Israel. Well, dude. Well, before Israel existed, Jews didn't have it good in America before 1948. Better than other minorities. Jews didn't have it good before in Europe before 1948. and they had it better in the Arab lands for sure. But they were still second class citizens. Why is that? I think you have it backwards. The reason Israel has these policies is because of the anti-Semitism, and it's not that's my honestly, it's an opinion. I understand it's an opinion and a perspective, but I don't understand how you could see it any other way.
Yeah. So first of all, like, obviously after 9/11, there was a ton of anti-Muslim Islamophobia in the U.S. Right? You had Muslims afraid to go out in public, even in the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. Right? So I think it's and then the same is true. I think, like, during the first Intifada, by the way, Palestinians were interviewed. There's some research that was published. I was just reading this recently, but so basically, in trying to understand the outbreak of the first Intifada, you had a number of researchers interview Palestinians who were protesting in those early years in 1987 and 1988, and asking them, why did you go protest? One of the things they said was that whenever there would be an attack against Israelis in Palestine, in Israel in the 1980s, they would face retribution at their place of work. It's the same thing Muslims face after 9/11 in the U.S., right? So whenever, say, there would be some attack against the Jew in Israel in, say, 1985, the Palestinian workers from Gaza and from the West Bank working in construction, working in agriculture, working in wherever they were working in Israel, they would face retribution at their place of work whenever there would be attacks against Jews. Same exact problem, right? So I think it works both ways, by the way. I'm not just saying, like, the only people to face retribution, the Jews of Europe, after Israel, kills Palestinians. I'm not saying that's the only, it's a two-way street, right? Whenever Israel kills Palestinians, Jews are face retribution. Whenever Palestinians kill Jews, the Palestinians face retribution in Israel. It works both ways.
But again, no, like you're, I'm not trying to be rude. Sorry. I just, passionate. But again, these people are at the very minimum, it's a conflict, right? Like, so facing retributions in Israel, that makes perfect sense. If Mexicans and Americans were killing each other, Americans in Mexico or Mexicans in America facing retributions makes sense. Like, there is no retribution happening of 9/11 is a great, fantastic point, 100%. But there's no retribution happening of Palestinian people in America, or that I know of in Europe. But I know this is true in America, that I know of in Europe either, though. And there is no collective responsibility being thrust upon Palestinians anywhere outside Israel. Yes, of course, 100%. But that's not being thrust upon Palestinians everywhere. This is a Jewish problem. And I'm sure there's other people in other parts of the world that I don't know about. If I talk about Pakistan with Hindus and Muslims, and I'm sure this isn't super, super unique. However, in our context here, it is there is a collective responsibility thrust upon us, whether we like it or not. And that doesn't happen. Like, even the 9/11, which is a fantastic example, there was a collective responsibility. I'm sure I was too young to understand, but I'm sure there was one against the Muslim people. Again, that's Muslims or Arabs who attacked America. This is Israel, and this is a world away. This is literally on the other side of the planet. And there's a collective responsibility, a collective guilt, or whatever sort of, like, that we're supposed to feel, and we are killed for and attacked for. That's not happening. It's just not happening in America. And I don't see it happening in Europe. Maybe it is, I just haven't seen it. I don't think that's controversial to say. Like, Israel's different.
Yeah, I think if you go to Europe and ask any minority group, any immigrant population in Europe, what it's like to be a Turk in Germany, what it's like to be Arab immigrant in France, what it's like to be an Indian or Pakistani immigrant in the UK, what it's like to be a Nigerian in Italy. Okay. Yeah. These groups face a tremendous amount of bigotry and racism, significantly greater, in my view, than the anti-Semitism that Jews face in the United States.
I'm not saying that at all.
I guess we just fundamentally disagree about that. the minorities I know, my Syrian friends in Germany. Oh my God, a tremendous amount of anti-Syrian racism in Germany. I mean, it's not even comparable. I mean, Jews are well integrated into the United States.
100%.
Bill Clinton, 5 of his top 6 foreign policy advisors were Jewish. 10% of Congress is Jewish. Jews are well represented in media, in politics, in Hollywood, in tech. Jews are represented in basically in journalism. I mean, you have many of the most
100%.
popular journalists are Thomas Friedman, probably the single most influential New York Times columnist is Jewish, right? Like many of the big banks have Jewish CEOs. Like this idea that Jews face like deep embedded, like rooted hatred in society, I think is just total nonsense. Of course, you have right-wing fascists that hate Jews, they hate blacks, they hate Mexicans, they hate trans people, they hate gay people, they hate all kinds of people. But I think to somehow claim that Jews face this like really serious like anti-Semitism in the U.S. certainly in comparison to other discriminated groups, in my opinion, in Europe and in other places in the world is just doesn't ring true to me.
That wasn't my point. My point isn't that Jews are the only ones facing bigotry. And yes, Jews are an overrepresented minority. That's part of, and we always have, literally everywhere we've gone, we end up being an overrepresented minority before shit goes down. And that's part of the story. Nietzsche writes about this a lot. And that's not my point, is to say no one else faces bigotry. And I would have to look into the Syrians in Germany and things like that. Again, like Europe, I just don't know. Also, like, when I put you in the pro-Palestine bucket, like you're definitely in a left bucket from this conversation, also from Twitter, but from this conversation I can tell you're very much in a left bucket and versus right. Because the fact that you can just sit here and say, oh yeah, there's alt-right. There's also, in my opinion, the bigger threat to Jews in America is the left. It's not even close. Like, yeah, a Nazi can come and shoot you at any time, but there's no one trying to, like, on the right, they're usually saying go back to Israel, go torture Palestinians. That's kind of the bigotry you hear. Versus on the left, they don't want, not everyone, again, this is the alt left. They don't want Jewish sovereignty in any sense, and they're the ones fighting very much against that. So when you're saying just the right there, it's just not true. And like it's a different. I'm not saying other people aren't discriminated against. I'm not saying Jews don't have it. Jews have it better in America right now today than any place, any time in history. 100%. I'm not saying other people don't have bigotry they have to deal with, and it's not worse in certain places or anything like that. That wasn't my point at all. My point is Jews around the world are held responsible for the actions of Israel, whether we like it or not. And again, I need to look into like Syria and Germany, if there's some sort of conflict there, or if it's just bigotry. Because in my mind, at least this is an American point of view. So in my mind, Muslims face bigotry, especially when Trump was running in 2016. I don't think anyone was more politicized by Trump and during his term, more politicized by Trump than Muslim people. And that was, if I had to choose one victim, quote unquote, victim of that presidency, I'd say it was the Muslim people. And obviously being black in America or being Native American, like there's people that have groups that, if we want to play this game, that have it much worse. None of that is my point. My only point is Jews are held responsible around the world for the actions, what imagined or real, of Israel. That doesn't happen consistently, at least with any other people. We'll see if that starts happening consistently with the Chinese.
I think
certainly potentially could happen.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but I do.
Yeah.
I would take issue with that point. I think when when COVID first broke out, you probably recall, there was a ton of anti-Chinese racism.
Yes.
When the United States was at war with Japan in World War II, there was a ton of anti-Japanese racism. I think whenever you have an adversary, for whatever reason, we tend to discriminating against that population that is represents that adversary. And so I guess I disagree. I think Jews are not unique in that sense. I think
you keep feeding in my point, and we'll move off after this because we're probably not going to be here. And I really want to continue the conversation. And we have spent about 30 minutes on it now. But I just think you keep feeding my point. Like, COVID hit America, and it's wrong. The anti-Chinese hate was very wrong. Stop Asian hate. I was a big supporter of that movement, and I do fear for Chinese people if you will see what happens in Taiwan. Like I do fear for Chinese people in America. Like that's definitely something to be afraid of. But again, you say adversary. Like when someone is an adversary, well, what like American adversaries? Yes, that again, Mexico America thing. Like yes, 100% that happens. But what makes a Jew, I mean, you're pretty, as you said, you're anti-Zionist. Like, what makes a Jew in Detroit or in Kansas or in France you don't know what that person thinks. And there's the Orthodox Jews who want the destruction of Israel. Like, what that person isn't your adversary. Like,
100%.
it's something, again, like whether we want it or not, and honestly, in my opinion, whether you recognize it or not, it is something that there's a collective responsibility for some reason that is thrust upon us that doesn't happen around the world unless you are a direct adversary. And again, I'll look into the Germany and Syria things because maybe I'm wrong, but in America for sure, unless you are a direct adversary or something affects Americans like COVID. And that, yeah, I don't
The
don't
same
understand the
thing.
perspective there, but yeah, I'll let you get the last word here, and then let's go back to the
Yeah,
dissertation.
I mean, look, this happens everywhere in the world, right? Like in India, for example, when there's a Muslim accused of raping a Hindu, there'll be
Yes.
retaliatory violence against Muslims in India. When Pashto in Pakistan commits an act, maybe the non-Pashtus in Pakistan are gonna, retaliate against them, right? This is a universal phenomenon. I think it happens in every country in the world. Whenever you have, especially a minority group that is perceived to be committing some act of violence, I think, whenever if a Mexican is, accused or convicted of raping a white person, then white people in the United States are going to look at Mexicans and say, wow, they're all rapists, right? So this happens, and then that Donald Trump used that language in his 2016 campaign, right? So I think whenever you have minority groups, you always have, and they're accused. This is the same in Europe, right? Whenever a Muslim immigrant in the Netherlands, commits some act of violence against a Dutch person, there's going to be retaliation against the Muslims, immigrants in the Netherlands. There's nothing unique about the Jews, is what I'm saying. This happens to every minority community in every country in the world, as far as I can tell. Whenever their group is perceived to have done something wrong, committed some wrongdoing, they're almost always in most countries in the world, in most contexts, there's retaliation against that group. That's the main point I'm trying to make.
No, I understand your point. I've already said mine, so I don't need to repeat it. So I do want to hold on to that. If you're a minority in a country, that statement for later on. However, let's get back to your dissertation because I want to get back to it, and we've already spent, I want to say, 40 minutes on this, and I'm really grateful that you don't have a time limit here. This is great because if this was most of my conversations last like an hour or so, and in that case, there would have been no time to talk about it at all, and we got an extra 40 minutes, and it's great. So, anywho, let's get back to your dissertation. We've gone through the 20s and the 30s, and now the big moment, 48 happens. Britain says peace. We're out of here. How? I'll let you take it away. I'll let you take it away from there.
Yeah, so I actually kind of end this story of my dissertation roughly in 48 because I'm trying to really explain the origins and development of this word, of this idea, of this concept, Palestine. And by 48, it's the term has become so popularized because it's been institutionalized and because it's been around in print, circulating in newspapers, because it's been the name of the state, of the colonial state that's been in Palestine for now decades. Like it's not really it's not really so much of a story of like how it got invented anymore. It's like what happens next. But we can talk about that, which is not, like I said, it's not really part of my dissertation, but happy to talk about it. After 48, the state of Israel suppresses the word Palestine. Right. So actually in the very early years of the state, there's some I think Shira Robinson talks about this in her book, Citizen Strangers. There's actually attempts within the certain ministries in the newfound state of Israel to actually suppress the word Palestine. For example, the Palestine Post, which is a newspaper, gets changed to the Jerusalem Post. You start to see scholars now talking about how the Arabs never called the place Palestine. Bernard Lewis being the one we've already discussed, but he publishes his magnum opus talking about the history of the word Palestine in 1975. You have Golda Meir saying there was no such thing as a Palestinian. I believe that's late 60s. So in the decades after the establishment of the state of Israel, there's now an attempt both by scholars as well as the state of Israel and politicians to act as though they never called the place Palestine, to act as though they never identified as Palestinian. It's a concerted effort. It's not like, this is just a conclusion of the research we did. No. Like they start with the conclusion that there is no Palestine, like in the case of Bernard Lewis, and then go into the sources, trying, looking for evidence that the term was not in use. So that's generally basically what happens in the 1960s and 70s. And, I think in part because you have these revolutionary movements, the Fatah, PFLP, DFLP, all under the umbrella of the PLO, these revolutionary movements of Palestinians committing these, attacks against civilians in Europe and Israel and elsewhere. And so I think, there's this attempt to basically, try and act as though these people never had a real identity, as though they never had any connection to Palestine. And then once Israel occupies the West Bank and Gaza and Jerusalem in 1967, they then take that initiative, that effort to wipe out Palestine. They now implement it in the occupied territories. So it's actually illegal to use the word Palestine in Gaza or the West Bank in the 1960s and 70s and 80s. In fact, the Bank of Gaza, there was a Bank of Palestine in Gaza. It was called the Bank of Palestine. And in 1980, when Israel occupied the West Bank and Gaza in 1967, they shut down all the banks. And in 1980, they were set to allow the Bank of Palestine in Gaza to reopen on condition that they change their name from the Bank of Palestine to something else, right? Because obviously the Bank of Palestine, the name itself, is inciting to violence. Merely using the word Palestine in the name of the bank for the Israeli military was a problem. And so the Palestinian owners of this bank took the Israeli military to court, and the court ruled that this bank would be allowed to use the name Bank of Palestine because it had already been grandfathered in. But no new bank or no new institution would be allowed to use the word Palestine in its title, in its name. So the name Palestine became illegal. You literally could not use, if you publish a book in Gaza or in the West Bank called Palestine in 1975, that would be banned by the Israeli military for inciting to violence. So the name was actually outlawed. In fact, even, any kind of political representation, even using the colors green, red, black, and white in artwork, in posters, that was also banned. That was made illegal. So there was actually a Gazan, and people went to prison. People were imprisoned for putting artwork out into the world that was made of green, red, black, and white. In Gaza in the 1980s. Yeah. I mean, that is just how, and people don't realize this because now, obviously,
it's not what you're taught. Yeah, it's not what you read. If you're on the pro-Israeli side, that's not what you're gonna hear. It's not what you're gonna read for sure.
So that kind of brings us to the 1980s. The word.
Actually, can we take a quick pause?
Sure.
So we jump from 48 to 67, and I don't think that's doing Palestinians justice, actually, real quick, because that's making the story about Jews. And in this particular, I know we just talked about Jews for a half hour, but in this particular case, the story is about Palestine, the word Palestine and Palestinians, because in 48 to 67, Egypt controlled Gaza and Jordan controlled the West Bank, and there were problems there. Do you write about that at all? Have you done any research into that at all?
Yeah. So what to say about the period 48 to 67? So Jordan occupied the West Bank and Jerusalem in 1948. The Jordanians, by the way, were just as bad as the Israelis. They also banned use of the word Palestine in the occupied West Bank from 1948 to 1967, as well as in Jordan proper. And I think the reasons were pretty obvious. They were just as scared as the Israelis were that the Palestinians would be a threat to their state. Right? Because, Jordan was a small country, a small population, and incorporated this massive number of Palestinians in 1948 and actually gave them all citizenship. So to its credit, it gave them citizens. Of course, Israel did not grant citizenship to the Palestinians when it occupied those territories. So in that sense, Jordan, I think, was better than Israel. But when it comes to the name Palestine itself, no, they outlawed usage of the word Palestine. In fact, you have an anecdote from, I believe, Dina Mutter, if I'm not mistaken. She's currently a professor, I believe, in SOAS in the UK. And she published a memoir, and she talks about growing up, I think in their 50s, in a refugee camp in the West Bank near Ramallah, and talks about how when she was in grade school, there was one anecdote she shares where she said, look, the teacher asked me where I'm from. And she innocently said, I'm from Palestine. And the Jordanian teacher took out a stick and hit her over the head and said, where are you from? She said, I'm from Palestine. And she hit her, and she got hit even harder over the head. And then she said a third time, where are you from? And she said, I'm from Palestine. She got hit even harder. And I think little did the 11-year-old schoolgirl, Dina Mutter, realize that even saying you're from Palestine was a problem in Jordan in the 1950s and 60s. And I think, it became, the Palestinians in Jordan by 1970 were suffering, extreme discrimination, right? You had Black September, where the Jordanian military surrounded these Palestinian refugee camps where the PLO was based and started literally shelling refugee camps, and thousands of people were killed. Of course, there was military resistance. The Palestinians killed hundreds of Jordanian soldiers, but the Palestinians in Jordan faced a tremendous amount of repression on the identity side of things until Black September. The PLO was kicked out. They relocated to Beirut and established a base in Beirut. Now, going to Gaza, the Palestinians in Gaza, faced even more repression. They were put under military occupation. They were, basically they were not allowed to move into Egypt. So they were, stuck in Gaza. They were not allowed to work in many industries. They had no freedom of movement. They didn't have political rights. They were not allowed to vote. So they were discriminated against significantly. Now, specifically as regards to the Palestinian identity, I don't think they faced discrimination. I think, you had Palestinians in Gaza talking about Palestine, hoping for a return to Palestine, calling themselves Palestinians. There wasn't that same repression on their identity in Gaza as there was in Egypt, to the best of my knowledge. I could be wrong about that, but that is my understanding. But yeah, I mean, once Israel occupied Gaza and the West Bank in 1967, obviously that changed.
Okay, it's good to know. That's good information. Good information. And then I don't know much about the history of Palestinians in Lebanon. I know there were guerrilla terrorists there. That there was Palestinian terrorism happening in Lebanon, and I know what's happening now, which is, I'm sure we can get into later. There's a power struggle actually happening now within the Palestinian refugee camps, and more innocent Palestinians are dying. So I would love to touch on that eventually, but I think that's a great recap. I definitely learned a little bit there between Egypt and Jordan's occupation. So now let's move to 67, the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, so after Israel occupied those territories in 1967, they imposed a military occupation. Before getting into kind of the details, I'm curious, like what aspects of the occupation are you most interested in discussing?
I mean, I'm happy to discuss whatever you want. As far as like what I'm most interested in would be present times and how to move forward into the future. I do love hearing the history of everything, which is like why I've loved kind of like the way we've done this from pre-modern times through the decades of modern times. I've loved that. But as far as if like what I am most personally interested in inside the occupation right now is, how do we go about ending it in a way where red lines aren't crossed for both Jews and Palestinians? And that does seem to be where the problems come up, actually. It's like people I've talked to and the interviews I've listened to is there seems to be a dismissal from whether you're arguing the pro-Palestine side or the pro-Israel side. There seems to be a dismissal of like, these are must-have items that we can't budge on of the other side. It seems to be like, oh, of course you can. So as far as the occupation goes, that my interest, my true heart interest is how do we figure this out? And obviously, like, we're not gonna figure it out today between you and me, but like, I think the more conversations you have, the closer you can get to comprehending something. Saying that, I don't think you can properly get to a conclusion unless you sway through the history, and you got dig, because there's a lot of this shit. There's a lot of this bullshit in there on both sides, no matter which side you come from, or if you're trying to come at this from like, I'm just a random, Christian British American, and I just want to know. You're still gonna have to like just dig through all of this propaganda on both sides. So that's what I'm most interested in. If you want to skip over, I guess, I mean, honestly, when I say skip over, I mean the Intifada, the Second Intifada, the wall going up, all these things are really modern times. So if we want to like skip to modern times and start talking about this issue, move past your dissertation now, I'd be happy to.
Yeah, let's talk about solutions. Let's talk about where we go from here. Rather than, I think where I would start is that not so much like what I think the parties should do, because that doesn't really matter, and they're not going to do what I think they should do, obviously. Yeah, so I'm not really sure it even really it makes sense to talk about that. I think what I would rather do is talk about where I think things are headed from here. Just if you just take the current trends and just try and plot them out 5, 10, 20 years into the future, where we're going, what direction we're going in. So in the West Bank, let's start with the West Bank, because I think at this point, the West Bank and Gaza, you really have to treat very differently, because they're in very different situations right now. So let's start with the West Bank. Right now, Israel is, and we have the most right-wing government in all of Israeli history that has actually transferred over administration of of the West Bank from the Israeli military to Smotrich, to the Israeli civilian administration. So it's essentially kind of almost like a de jure annexation, right? Like the occupied territory is not being occupied by the Israeli military, it's being occupied by Israeli civilian governments. So that's one point to make. In other words, the West Bank is now increasingly becoming part of Israel, right? You've got 800,000 Israeli settlers living in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. You've got hundreds, if not thousands, of miles of Israeli-only roads built in the West Bank. You've got cities of 50,000 people. I mean, Ariel is a city of 50,000 people. It's not a town. It's not a settlement. It's a city. Okay, you've got. And things are only getting more entrenched, right? More settlements, more settlers, more roads, more wall, more Israeli control, more confiscations of Palestinian land, more home demolitions, more expulsions in the southern Hebron Hills, in the zone between, basically to the east of Jerusalem, kind of to the east of Ma'ale Adumim, that big zone there. I think it's called E2. You also have expansions in the north, Beitah, settlers taking over areas of the West Bank, pretty much everywhere. So Israeli rule in the West Bank is only entrenching itself further. And that trend is only going to increase. And so if you ask yourself in 5, 10, 20 years, Mahmoud Abbas is what, 85, 86? I forget how old he is now, but he's not going to be around for that much longer. At some point, more Palestinians will realize that the Palestinian Authority is part of Israel's occupation rather than representing some kind of opposition to it. And that's already become clear to most Palestinians in the West Bank. If you go back to the funerals of some of the Palestinian militants that were killed in Jenin just a few weeks ago, when Israel invaded Jenin, destroyed, I think, 3,000, majority of the homes in the Jenin refugee camp were destroyed. They just bulldozed through entire streets, killed however many Palestinians. Was it a few dozen, I believe?
I do want to point out that it wasn't a few dozen. It was less than 20. Every single one was confirmed a soldier, like however you want to call it, terrorist soldier of some sort.
Militants. No question about that. They were militants. Yeah. So where was I going with that? So basically, Israel is entrenching its rule. Where I was going with that is just sharing an anecdote. One of the funerals of one of those militants, some high-ranking PA officials tried to attend that funeral, and they were booed. They were basically not even allowed to attend the funeral because they represented the Palestinian Authority, which is a part of the Israeli occupation government. And so we've gotten to a point now where a majority of Palestinians in the West Bank reject the PA and are turning to kind of violent militancy to overthrow the occupation regime. And so I think, and so that's going to only entrench Israel even more because they're going to, try and kill more militants and, impose more curfews and more closures. So Israeli rule in the West Bank is getting more entrenched and more intense. And there's more confiscations and there's more settlements and more settlers. I think all of that will eventually, I can't really give you a timeline, but I think all of that will eventually lead more and more Palestinians to say, this whole Palestinian Authority thing is not what we want. These people do not represent us. They're corrupt. We haven't had elections for a president in 15 years. We haven't had elections for a legislature in 20 years. Right? This is not a government. This is not an institution that we want to have anything to do with. And I think at that point, once they say the PA does not represent us, at that point, what is Israel going to do? It has to essentially reoccupy all the streets of Jenin and Nablus and Ramallah and Bethlehem, and Israel has no interest in doing that. Israel does not want to send Israeli 18, 19, 20-year-old kids onto the streets of Nablus and Jenin and Bethlehem and Ramallah. They do not want to do that, but they won't have a choice. So I think the West Bank, what will happen is we'll have this, there'll be this within Palestinian society, there'll be different trends, and it's not clear which one will succeed. You'll have the militant trend, which is unfortunately right now the trend that is becoming more popular and more predominant. But then you also have obviously the nonviolent trend, the Palestinian protesters in Beitah, Palestinian protesters in Nil Ain, Palestinian protesters in Sheikh Jarrah, Palestinian protesters in the southern Hebron Hills. So you'll have the nonviolent trend, and then you'll have the violent trend, and it's anybody's guess which one wins. Obviously, I'm hoping for the nonviolent trend. I think that's the only one that's going to work. There's no violent solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict. We know that. Israel's much stronger.
Yeah.
They'll crush these militias. They'll all get – it's just a recipe for disaster and destruction and death. And so I think whereas I think if Palestinians pursue the nonviolent path, they have a much better chance of success. So we'll see what happens. No, it's anyone's game. But I think ultimately the PA will go away. It will dissolve. It will disintegrate. It will become irrelevant. And then we'll see which trend persists. Will it be that Palestinians, through nonviolent means, demand equal rights, civil rights inside Israel? They demand to be citizens of the state of Israel with equal rights as any other Jew in Jaffa or Jerusalem or Beersheba? Or will they demand an independent state? I don't know. I mean, that's up to them to decide. It's not up for me or you to decide. They'll have to make that choice, whether they want independence or whether they want to be part of Israel. And I think ultimately Israel will not really ever grant sovereignty to a Palestinian state in the West Bank. Israel covets that territory too much. Israel wants control of the border with Jordan. Israel wants control of E2. Israel wants to protect its 800,000 settlers. Israel wants to control the high points. Israel wants to control the water. Israel wants to control the airspace. Israel wants to control the telecommunication lines. Israel wants to control the population registry. Israel wants to control the West Bank. It just doesn't want to give the people in it citizenship. So I think the people will eventually come to that realization. I hope they will, that we're never going to get independence. There's no chance in hell Israel will ever give us that. So why don't we just fight for equal rights inside Israel rather than become this subjected permanent, live in this permanent state of occupation? So we'll see what happens. It's up to the Palestinians what path they take. In the Gaza Strip, I think the situation is very different. And I think here there's a few key factors. One, what will happen with Hamas? Recently, just in the past week, we saw protests on the streets of Gaza against Hamas. Hamas is not exactly ruling, with any type of democratic institutions. There's no rule of law. You can be imprisoned and beaten for looking at a Hamas official the wrong way. For being a member of Fatah, you can be imprisoned. You can be imprisoned for being gay. You can be imprisoned for, maybe just not abiding by, strict Islamic customs. So there's no semblance of democracy in Gaza. And I think that will eventually catch up to Hamas. It already is right now, as we said. So, we'll see whether or not Hamas is capable of maintaining its autocratic rule in Gaza or not. It's not clear to me. And then also we'll see what Israel, basically how Israel relates to that government. Like right now, you have Israeli ministers Ben Gvir and Smotrich basically coming out and saying Hamas is our asset. PA is a liability. Hamas is an asset. Why are they saying that? Because whenever Hamas fires rockets, every American politician says Israel has a right to defend itself. And whenever, Hamas, digs a tunnel and kidnaps an Israeli soldier, every European politician in Brussels says Israel has a right to defend itself. So Hamas is an asset for Israel. Israel has an active interest in keeping this, what is regarded by most Western governments as a terrorist organization. Israel has an interest in keeping that government in power in the Gaza Strip, because it justifies more investment in the Israeli defense capabilities through the Iron Dome system. It justifies the $3 billion Israel gets from the United States every year. It justifies the veto that the U.S. often makes in the Security Council, the resolution. So Israel loves Hamas. It's actually the best thing that I think Israel can hope for right now. Of course, Israel doesn't love the rockets, but so few Israelis are killed by rockets that it doesn't really threaten Israel in any real sense. It's a threat to the citizens that live close to Gaza, obviously, who are traumatized by the rockets, but basically it doesn't really threaten the government in any serious sense. It doesn't threaten the Israeli population or, Israel standing in the international community. Again, like I said, it actually benefits from having this terrorist government on its border. So again, I think the two key factors are how does Israel relate to this government? I think in the future, Israel will want to have Hamas there. And then also what the people of Gaza want. Will they protest against Hamas? Will they vote in a government that represents them? To be determined.
There's a lot there. I appreciate all of it. I think what you're saying is true for the most part. I start with Gaza and then I'll go back to the West Bank. And then I'd like to say what, eventually it's like, this might be 20 minutes from now. So eventually that's okay, well, if you're the emperor of the world, how do you solve this from here? But as far as Gaza goes, I'll agree with you. The current Israeli government, yeah, that makes sense. They see them as an asset, but the current Israeli government, I hate saying it's Israel or you can see through hundreds of thousands of protesters that this current government, it's very scary. And it's like you said before in this conversation, it's not even pro-Jewish. It's not even it's a very scary government that is able to take control, and they're gaining more control through their Supreme Court, the new Supreme Court law ruling of the unreasonableness law. And I see how this government could see them as an asset. I hate saying I'm sure you also know a handful of some people in Israel. Like, this isn't Israel, but this current Israeli government. If this current Israeli government is going to maintain control, which human beings, once we get control, power, we want to maintain control and power, and we have our interest in doing that. We do it through these nationalist states that we expand their power to expand our power and all of those things. Under this current Israeli government, yeah, I see that. My hope, and real quick, let's go to West Bank, and then I'll get to my hope for it, and then I was going to invoke Cornel West. In the West Bank, it's much more blurry, as you said, as obviously that it's much more blurry than in Gaza, and this is where like Jewish fear kicks in too, because I agree again under this, the situation, especially under this government, just seems hopeless. They're just getting more and more entrenched. The government just approved another settlement to be built between two Palestinian cities, and it's just going to further fragment and further set up barriers, and they're being very successful with what they want to implement, which is more Jews in the West Bank, total control to the Jordanian border. And you're right when you say it's going to be one of two things. I hope it's not the militant routes, because again, like, there's no hope. Like, if this current Israeli government, if they want to get to the border and have maintained full control, the only part I disagree with is, why would this government care if they're sending in 18 to 20-year-old Israelis? Like, they want full control, and eventually, if the militant protest wins out over the peaceful protest, that's what's going to happen, and that terrifies me, because I think another Nakba could occur, and that would just if that is what wins, that's going to be very scary, because they're not going to, most likely they're not going to win, and unfortunately, from my perspective, like, I don't want them to win. If they win, that means Israel's gone. That means a lot of dead Jews, but also it's not, you can't reasonably say it's possible. You can't reasonably say they're going to win at all. Israel's just too powerful at this point in time. If the peaceful protest is how it goes, which is, I hope is how it goes, even that puts some fear into me, because especially under this current government, a holdout of the West Bank isn't going to happen. Removing settlers isn't going to happen. They're probably not going to move the line of the West Bank at all. However, I will touch on this later, it is possible. It's definitely possible that a pullout could happen. So an independent state under this Israeli government wouldn't happen. They're also not going to get granted equal rights under this government. However, if they do, and all of a sudden there's a flip from a Jewish majority to an Arab majority, or as Peter Bernard would call them, he calls them all Palestinians, a Palestinian majority, now I'm pretty scared for Jews again. Like, and like you said, the minority thing we talked about before, that's scary. That's very scary, especially because I know you don't believe Jews are unique, but I'd say you need to read more Nietzsche, and you need to read more philosophers, and like we're not the only ones that experience bigotry by any means. Of course not. Every minority does everywhere you go. The Jewish story is just different. It's unique the same way the Black story is unique, and like all of these stories are unique. It's a unique story, and it's a unique hatred, and that just puts fear in me. It really does put fear in me. I don't know what would happen, and I have no evidence. There's zero evidence for me to believe from history that a Jewish minority would be safe in an Arab majority controlled country. However, this would be the largest Jewish minority. That could be different. Who really knows what would happen? Maybe it does exist peacefully. It's definitely possible. But like, if you don't have fear of that, I would say you're ignorant, and you just choose not to have fear of that outcome. My hope, and then real quick, I want to bring up a book called The Next 100 Years by George Friedman. It doesn't mention Israel Palestine. It mentions the bigger players. And it's a prediction for the next 100 years. Peter Zahn's another author that writes about this type of stuff. And George Freeman, he and many, many others, including Peter and all these guys, they predicted this Ukrainian-Russian war back in the 90s. Like they saw this coming, and like that's kind of what they do. He writes in the beginning of that book, Next 100 Years. The beginning's a really, really cool introduction, because it talks about what you think would happen if you were taking a guess about what's going to happen, what the world's going to look like in 1920 if you're taking a guess in 1900s. And then it fast forwards to the 1920s. And it's okay, 1920, what do you think the world's going to look like in 1940? And then it fast forwards. And 1940 to the 60s, and it does this whole thing throughout every 20 years. They're dead wrong every time. The predictions are dead wrong every single time. And that gives me hope to be like, we don't know. And like, Israel has offered a two-state solution in the past a handful of times. I want to say upwards of more than 7 times. 47, 48, 68, 2000, 2001. 2016, 2019. And there's arguments, especially with the 2019 one or 2019, 2020, I can't remember what year. There's arguments like, why would they accept that? Anyone that argues the 48, 68, the 2000, like anyone that argues those ones, I'd highly push back on. This should have been accepted. But it's possible. I mean, it's definitely 100% a possibility that a government comes in, says, hey, we want equal rights for Palestinians. We want them to have their own state. We are going to pull out these settlers. In 2005, I don't know. I haven't done research into this, so I really don't know when I say that. I don't know if in 1990 or in 2000, it was viewed as reasonable or possible that Israel would take out all the Jews from Gaza, but they did. So I think it's definitely possible that happens. I think that's the way they could coexist peacefully, is you got to just remove a ton of settlers, and you move the line a little bit if you don't want to remove everybody. But I wouldn't say it's impossible. I hope it wouldn't be impossible, because it's a messy, blurry situation when it comes to the West Bank, if that all makes sense.
Totally.
Yeah. And then finally, I'll go back to you after this. It's kind of get into like if we were making the decisions, because Cornel West gave his solution as he's running for president. He'll probably run with the Green. I think he is running with the Green Party. So he'll be a third party candidate, and he's definitely the darling of the left, the way that Bernie Sanders was the darling of the left in 2016, 2020. And he's probably going to take votes away from Biden, which, some people on the left are going to hate and all that stuff. But his answer to the IP conflict is the most popular one for the left, especially like the hard alt left, radical left, whatever you want to call them. And it's basically one state, but the oversight of the entire state is given to the UN. And that's a terrible idea. It's a horrible, terrible, god-awful idea. I mean, it's completely ignorant of what the UN is.
What agency or what body within the UN would govern Israel, according to Cornel West?
He just said the UN. He hasn't expanded on it. At least not that I've seen. He hasn't expanded on it yet. I think he's just ignorant to what the UN is, and no Israeli should let that happen. Or Jew, if you care about Israel, should let that happen. So, but it does. But I will give him credit for it. He's saying something. He's not just like, and I like, if I have to choose a candidate today, of the candidates that are actually running, not just who I want to be it. I like RFK. I think I'd choose him, but even he's just lockstep with Biden, Trump. He's just locked. There's no new solutions coming, and it's just gonna be more of what you said. Like what you said, I agree with. Like this is what's happening at the moment. I hope in 20 years it could look different, but I have no pushback on what you said. So saying that, if you got to be president, if you had a ton of influence, how would you go about? What would your suggestion be to get this peaceful resolution?
I think the United States. What would I do if I was like U.S. president? Is what you're saying? Well, from the U.S. perspective, yeah. I think we need to apply pressure on the Israeli government to stop violating Palestinian rights. And I think first and foremost, we're talking about just basic rights. Like, so for example, in Gaza, depending on the month, depending on the day, you're going to get a few hours of electricity a day. Why is that? Why can't Gazans get enough electricity? Well, because Israel doesn't allow the electricity in. That's why. If you're a fisherman in Gaza, Israel kills usually a few dozen Gaza fishermen, or injures a few dozen Gaza fishermen every year, because they don't let them fish beyond a certain point. Why is that? Why is Israel preventing Gazan fishermen from fishing? Why is it that you can't import all kinds of things that are not dual use things that are you can't import things into Gaza. You can't import basic things that you and I use every day into Gaza. Yeah. You see, 90% of people don't have access to fresh drinking water. They turn on their tap and salt water comes out. Okay. These people, you're talking about 2 million people living in subhuman conditions. The unemployment rate in Gaza is 75%. The poverty rate, the extreme poverty rate is 50%, because these people don't have a right to life. They don't have a right to build an economy, to export, to import, to open schools, to open factories. They can't. There's no way to run an economy when you literally are disconnected from the outside world. Why is that? So we need to apply pressure on Israel to lift that siege, because these people are suffering. They have nothing. They live on nothing. They live on handouts from the UN, and so this is just unacceptable. It's collective punishment. It's illegal under international law. Why are we making 2 million people day in and day out suffer? It's just
Can I ask a couple questions there?
It's so inhumane.
I actually, these are genuine questions. Well, one big one, because this is something I haven't got an answer for, and I'm just curious. The Israeli blockade, the Israeli siege, people, I hear this all the time. I'm very confused, because I know Israel's relationship with Egypt is not good. There's a peace, but it is not a good, friendly thing that's happening. And Gaza has two borders. So I'm very confused on the Israeli blockade, and it's never called an Israeli-Egyptian blockade. What is Egypt's part in this?
Yeah, I mean,
Do they have
it's
a part in it?
Israel with Egypt's support is how you might want to call it. It's an Israeli blockade that is supported by Egypt. There's very close security cooperation between Israel and Egypt on the Rafah border crossing. Okay,
Yeah.
the Egyptian military has the same interest more or less as the Israeli military here. Egypt does not want Palestinians. We're talking about Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. He's an autocrat. He's worse than Hosni Mubarak. He's imprisoned 60,000 Muslim Brotherhood members. And guess what? Hamas is a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood.
I didn't know that last part. The 60,000. I had no idea.
Oh, I mean, they arrest people for tweeting about tweeting. I'm pro gay rights in Egypt. If I tweet that in Egypt, I'm at risk of getting thrown in prison. Egypt you have fewer rights in Egypt than you do in most countries in the world. There's no freedom of the press. There's no freedom of expression. It's an autocratic state. It's a militaristic state, and they have no interest in letting Palestinians from Gaza out. So with Israeli cooperation, by the way, there's close collaboration there. So, I mean, I would say it's an Israeli-led, Egyptian-supported blockade. That's how I would describe it. But you're absolutely right. I mean, Egypt is I wouldn't say just as complicit, but they're complicit, obviously.
Okay. So that makes sense. I've never got an answer for that. And that's like, my goal through these conversations, online, offline, isn't to get you. Gotcha. I definitely get heated at times when I hear things about just lies about Israel. I definitely heated. Like, my goal is never gotcha. It's like, yeah, I want to get to the truth, and I want to try and find solutions. And unfortunately, before you, that's always been a gotcha question. And I'm like, I just need someone to explain this to me. So I appreciate that a lot. And then I actually also on your solution, if you're president, I agree that as an American, if I'm separating myself from the Jewish part of it, and I'm an American, if I'm my friends from Kansas who the vast majority of my friends from Kansas are, based on what you think from Kansas, they're Republicans. And when I was in 2016, I'm thinking like I hated Trump. There's nothing more embarrassing about my social media history than 2015, my Facebook. If you want to go back and embarrass me, I hated Trump. I won't be that embarrassed by it because, I just don't like the guy, but like it was basically every day. I'm like, you cannot vote for this guy. You cannot. This is a horrible, horrible human being. And like, I'm just going off. And when I went back home from college, I was the one guy out of 20 people at the party. I'm the one that's like, you're voting for Trump? What? And like, you're voting for Hillary? What? Like, they're those guys. So, and gals, if you put yourself, I put myself in those shoes, in America First shoes. I'm a president of America, and I'm putting myself in America First shoes. I have no problem putting pressure on Israel in that sense. And like, hey, unfortunately for Israel, there's a huge economic tie here. And unfortunately, it's just what's developed over the last 70 years. And as a Jew, I want Israel to cut those ties. So I want a plan put in place where you can become fully just self-sufficient. And instead of getting $3 billion every year from America, but America is giving Israel that money. And like, you have pull, you have sway. And I think it would be appropriate to use it. Obviously, the government disagrees. Obviously, I don't know exactly why. That's a whole other conversation that if we have them this time, we could have. But for now, I think that's completely appropriate. And if I was president, what I would do is, I think this is a win-win-win. I think I said it 3 times. I hope I said it 3. Win-win-win. What I would do is say, hey, here's what we're going to do. We're going to have the UN, instead of invoking Cornel West, instead of them coming in and having the rights over Israel and Jews and Palestinians alike and everything, we're going to have the UN come in, or the U.S. military, although I don't like the U.S. military going places, and it's not really America First per se, come in, and they're going to ensure, without Israeli interference and try and keep things peaceful, elections for the West Bank, the Palestinians of the West Bank, and the Gazan people. We're going to ensure a safe and fair election. And I think this is a win-win-win. Obviously, first and most importantly, the Palestinians get proper representation for what they want. And this is going to be a years process. Like, you got to go in and protect the candidates. You're going to occupy the space, which leads me to a win for the Israeli supporters. Is that okay? All of a sudden, if IDF slowly transfers this power for a time of occupation to an outside force, and now this is up to you to properly control this. And obviously Israel's going to protect its borders and everything, and I know it's messy with the settler situation. It'd be very messy. I get that, but if you give whatever percentage it is, whatever land pieces, that however that all plays out, the UN's now occupying to make sure this happens. All of a sudden, if there's any deaths of Palestinian citizens, like, it takes away from the argument of, the IDF is just this horrible, terrible thing. And if you're pro-Israel, like, you should, this is an opportunity for you. Also, if you're as far as arguments go, as far as like, if we're playing the political argument sports game here, if you're pro-Palestine, it's a win in my mind, because, well, what if they come in and they occupy for a year or two and they ensure these free elections and nobody dies? All of a sudden, you have a big political chip of, hey, obviously the IDF is doing things wrong. Y'all just did this. Everyone else just did this, and then things were fine. And like, in my mind, like, and obviously, again, the first most important thing is proper representation for the Palestinian people. That's like, I think that's the biggest thing. But I think the consequences of that are also politically great for everyone involved. That's my thoughts. I know it can change. I know, and that's the goal, is to make these things change. But that's my thought. When I saw what Cornel West said, I kind of like marinated on it for a minute, and that's where I got to.
Yeah, I think before elections, I think there are things, to my mind at least, that are more important right now, like just basic rights, kind of like access to electricity, access to clean water, right to build a home. Palestinians don't have those rights in many parts of the West Bank, or in Gaza. So for me, it's just like basic human rights, right to life, right to prosperity. Those things are, I think, the most pressing. And that's what I would focus on. Look, political elections, I mean, even before you have elections, right, you need to have political parties. You need to have, you need to have free speech. Palestinians don't even have that, right? Like, Palestinians in the West Bank don't have that. Palestinians in Gaza don't have that. I mean, you're sort of, I think you're 5, 10, 20 years ahead
Down
of
the
yourself.
road.
But
Yeah.
it's like, if you had free and fair elections in the West Bank right now, Hamas would win, right? Because they're well organized. They already have leaders. They already have, political representatives. They already, they're well organized already. We saw this whenever, what happened in Egypt in 2013 is a great example. The parties, it's not the Egyptians, for the most part, supported the Muslim Brotherhood in 2013 when there were elections, when Mohammed Morsi got elected. It's that they were the best organized. And so you had all these secular Egyptian intellectuals trying to, build political parties, build coalitions, but it takes time. It's hard to organize. It's slow.
Yeah.
And so the parties that were already well organized had a huge advantage. And so, lo and behold, the Muslim Brotherhood got elected. But I don't think that's really what, there are a lot of Egyptians that did not want the Muslim Brotherhood, and ultimately they were overthrown in what I would describe as a coup. But I think ultimately the problem was that there wasn't enough time for the Egyptian society to really organically, grassroots level, develop political parties, to organize. So I think if you just introduce free and fair elections into the Palestinian territories tomorrow, you're just going to get the groups that have already had a history of organizing, already have political candidates, already have are already embedded into Palestinian society. Those groups will have a huge advantage. So I think focus on rights, and then you can focus on politics.
It's very true. It's a great point. Fantastic point. I like it. I like it a lot. And I think that's where, let's go back to the rights here. Let's stay on the rights, I should say. That's where the emphasis should be. I think there should be a handful, like even a few specific rights. I think what you said, the right to build, end the blockade, or at least like take a list of items, including electricity, that are being blocked, and just focus on those and hammer away at those. And I think if that was finally here, I'm going to transition us now that we're 2 hours in, to something that I very much disagree with you about, actually, extremely so. If that was the message and the sole message of the squad here in America, Rashid Tlaib, AOC, Ilhan Omar, I think they'd be shocked in how much people like myself, who pro-Israel, I very much care about Jewish safety and all those things, would be like, yeah, no, I'm with that, because I'm talking with you and I'm with that. You tweeted today that Rashid Tlaib is not anti-Semite in response to somebody, and it's shame on you. It's lessening anti-Semitism, which by the way, that does happen. The Corey guy, I can't remember his last name, that had his tweet blow up with a Palestinian flag painted on a wall in Belgium was like, oh, this is anti-Semitic. It's like, dude, no, it's not. It's a Palestinian flag. Like, you can't just say that. That cheapens anti-Semitism. Things like that happen with all the races. Bigotry, like, it cheapens it. And Shid's leave is not it. No. She has said many anti-Semitic things. She equated the U.S. and Israel to Hamas and the Taliban. Current day U.S. And Israel. She said the same people who are behind the curtain. Oh, the fuck was it? It was the same people who are behind the curtain to prevent a free Palestine. Yeah, this is it. The same people who are behind the curtain to prevent a free Palestine are the same people who are exploiting Americans. That's clear as day anti-Semitic trope. She fully supports the BDS movement, and you can go to their website. Their goal is the dismantlement of Israel, and it's the dismantlement of the Jewish state. In 2021, when the flare-up happens and Hamas is sending thousands of rockets, she doesn't say a word about Hamas. And also, Hamas was sending those rockets, citing their 88 charter. There's an updated charter which still wants the destruction of Israel, but they were citing the 88 charter when that was happening, saying like the day of justice will come when the Muslims will fight the Jew and kill the Jews. That was being cited at the time. She accused Jews in the Congress of due loyalty when she said, quote, they forget which government they're representing, while also having a Palestinian flag outside of her office. If a Jew did that with an Israeli flag, you would not hear the end of it. There's a list. I mean, there's so many things. She shares anti-Semitic memes all the time. She's done it multiple times online. Like, what are you talking about? How can you say this isn't anti-Semitism?
Yeah, look, I without getting into any of the particulars of any of those examples you raised, which, I honestly I'm not familiar with a lot of them, so we could pull them up and talk about any specific case if you want to. But I think in general, my view here is that you have anti-Semitism on the left and anti-Semitism on the right, and in my view, the anti-Semitism on the right is much more dangerous and poses a much greater threat to Jews, and there's many more of them on the right than there are on the left. Let me elaborate. Why is it more dangerous? Because the anti-Semites on the right form militias. Okay, one of the biggest threats in the United States right now is actually domestic terrorism. It's these white nationalists. Most of them are, they're neo-Nazis, they're anti-Semites, and they have militias and they have guns. These are, the gung-ho Trump supporters. These people, in my view, pose a much greater threat to Jews than the anti-Semites on the left. I mean, look at the Pittsburgh shooter, anti-Semite on the right. The people actually committing the violent. I'm talking about the people actually committing the violent anti-Semitic attacks. Look at Charlottesville, anti-Semitism on the right. If you look at any of the violent cases of anti-Semitism in the United States, they're almost always from the right.
Sorry, keep going.
Well, I mean,
that's not true. The big ones, yeah. So Pittsburgh, which is the biggest killing, 11 Jews. This is, again, Jews in America are blessed for Jews throughout history. Like 11 people dead is the biggest anti-Semitic attack ever in America. That's actually fantastic. Like, that's a small number.
What are the violent ones on the left?
Kentucky, BLM activist in Kentucky shot a Jew who was running for Congress during the 2021 flare-up. It was Muslims who were on the left jumping Jews in LA and Brooklyn that stabbed Orthodox Jews in Boston. There's tons of violent attacks. They're just not. Okay. They're not promoted by the media, because most of the media outside of Fox and Ben Shapiro's Daily Wire and stuff, which Ben Shapiro, you would argue, doesn't want to talk about Charlottesville and things of that nature. And there's tons of them. They're just not talked about in mainstream media, and you have to look for it. And you have to look for it because they're not going to. Those things aren't reported. They're reported by Israeli journalists more than I'll see American ones. Even the one in Boston, there were more things foreign that were reported in America. It happens all the time. Also, there's a book that I think you should read called Woke Army. It's by Asra Nomani. She's a Muslim she's a reporter. She was reporting in the Middle East, nothing to do with Jews, it's Middle Eastern reporting. Her partner got killed. She writes about the coalition between the alt-left, radical left, communist woke, whatever you want to call them, and the Arab right, the Middle Eastern right, and it's in how it forms the woke army, the coalition there. I think truly you're just not paying attention to that side because that's your team. And this is what we do as humans. I do it too. I'm guilty of it as well. You're just not paying attention to that side because that is your side. And what we do and how I 2021, I saw the anti-Semitism. Like, that's what I saw. I didn't see Israel's violation of human rights. I wasn't like, that's not what I saw in front of me. I had to go dig. And I think if you dig, you would, again, Rashid Tlaib and all these people, like, I think if you dug, you would be shocked at what you found.
By the way, I'm not disputing that there's anti-Semitism on both sides at all. I mean, I am acknowledging, in fact, that there's anti-Semitism on the far right and the far left. I mean, I think that's pretty obvious. What I'm saying is that the violent incidents are more often, and the more violent the incident, the more likely it is to be on the right. I mean, I think that's.
I would guess you're right. I would guess you're right, actually, but I think the percentage of it is.
And then, in terms of the actual number of anti-Semites, I think there's no comparison. I think on the right, you have tens of millions of evangelical Christians, almost like the hardcore ones, the ones that believe in these eschatological views around Jews all winding up in the Holy Land, and then when Jesus comes, they all die. I mean, these people, we're talking tens of millions of American evangelicals. There's no comparison on the left. I mean, no comparison. On the left, we're talking a very fringe, tiny number. Maybe you got, but on the right, we're talking literally tens of millions of people. I mean, how many evangelical anti-Semites are there in the U.S.? I mean, 30 million, 40 million, 50 million?
Ooh, okay, dude. That's hold up on that. Holy shit, dude. No. If you
these people all believe Jews control the world. I mean, many of these evangelical Christians have extremely problematic anti-Semitic views.
Okay, please stop for a second. Yeah. Please let me talk, please.
Go for it.
Whoa. This is the first time where I'm like, dude, you gotta stop talking. Okay. You need to visit some of these small evangelical Christian towns. I'm kind of from one of them. Like,
totally.
That is not what people that you're saying 10 million, 20 million, 50 million. No, dude. Like there are evangelical Christians that hate Jews. That all this stuff. That is not the vast majority. That what you just did there would be me looking at all the Muslim people and saying they all hate Jews. That is what you just said is not okay.
Oh, sorry, I don't mean to. I apologize. Let me take what I said.
Yeah,
I don't mean to brand all
do.
of American evangelicals as anti-Semites. You have a big problem in the evangelical American community. I'm not here to claim that all of these people are anti-Semites. Many of them harbor anti-Semitic beliefs about Jews. I mean, this is undeniable. I mean, many of the evangelical preachers are openly anti-Semitic. I mean, it's a huge problem.
Why? But it's also very true about Muslim Americans. But the same thing is true.
There's what 6, 7, 8 million Muslim. How many Muslims are in the U.S.? I mean,
you're right. No, you're right.
When we're talking numbers, that was the point I was making. I was talking about sheer numbers. How many Muslims are in the U.S.?
But okay, so
10 million, 15 million. I don't know the exact number. So how many evangelicals are in the U.S.? 50 million.
I'm with you. But let's break this down, right?
Yeah.
So let's say percentage. We don't know this, but let's say percentage wise. The same amount. It's the same amount of anti-Semitism percentage-wise. So the number is bigger on the evangelical Christian side. With you. Now let's keep going. A lot of anti-Semitism, the majority of it on the left that I see, the violent attacks do. It's not always, but it does tend to be Muslim if it's coming from the left. However, there's a ton. I don't know the number, but there's also a lot of anti-Semitism and Jew hatred coming from the Black community and even the LGBTQ community. There's been multiple times where during these pride parades, there's a Jewish star with the pride thing on it, and they get kicked out, and times where they've gotten beaten up. So if we're gonna play that numbers game, but if you add it all up and go group by group by group by group, there's anti-Semites in every single group, and the ones on the left and the ones on the right are going to be about the same. If you want to say most of the violent attacks, and I would agree with you most, but the percentage is pretty close, in my opinion. Come from the right, sure. But also, the left is more educated, and the educated arguments, the dismantling of Israel and BDS, the movement, that's a true danger to Israel and Jews. Those are the movements, and that stuff comes from the left. So I think it all does even out, right?
Well, I think we're obviously not going to agree on,
of course,
what we call like a definition of anti-Semitism. I think the number one problem that I would say right now that exists in the debate around anti-Semitism is that many things that are not anti-Semitic are being described as anti-Semitic, which is polluting the term anti-Semitism and making it unusable as a description, as a label. And so you have the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which conflates criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism. And so it's not even obvious to me that a lot of this anti-Semitism that maybe you see on the left is even anti-Semitism. It's criticism of Israel. Now, when does criticism of Israel become anti-Semitic? That's an interesting question we can debate. But unfortunately, right now, I would say the vast majority of things that are being described as anti-Semitism on the left are actually not anti-Semitism. They're criticism of Israel. And we can open up that debate if you want, but we are kind of running on 2.5 hours. So maybe we we pick that up in another conversation.
I would love to have another conversation with you. That'd be amazing. I think 2.5 hours is about where we should start getting to the wrap up questions. And by the way, I've enjoyed this conversation immensely. I know I can get intense at times, but like I've enjoyed it immensely, and I've learned, and obviously we're not going to agree on everything. That's the point. So and also when I comment on your stuff on Twitter, I hope you know that it's coming with this tone as well, because I know text and Twitter can get the tones hard to read. If you ever see my name pop up, it's always in this tone where I'm trying to find truth and seek understanding.
I'm with you, by the way, Troy. I use Twitter to learn, and I use Twitter to spread a message, obviously, but I'm also there to learn. And I first and foremost, I admit when I'm wrong. I make mistakes. I say things that I later regret saying, and we all do that. It's
of course
social media, and first and foremost, I wish it was I wish Twitter or YouTube or Threads or Instagram, wherever you're active, I wish there was more openness to sharing things and being open-minded about things you disagree with. And I'm with you on that. I'm a truth seeker like you. So
I can
maybe
tell.
One message we can leave to our listeners is that regardless of your political viewpoint, if you're open and honestly interested in getting to the truth, then we want to hear from you. So yeah, we can leave it at that maybe.
That's beautiful. I'd love to leave it at that. I'd usually have closing questions, but you know what? Let's do it next time because of the same closing questions. And so, Zach, I appreciate you. This has been a wonderful conversation. I can't wait to share it. I can't wait to have another one. And in the meantime, I'll talk to you on Twitter, both in DMs and in the feed.
Troy, looking forward to that.
Thanks so much, man. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay. Thanks for having me on.